CD 7.
Chapter 15. Shown to a comfortable set of apartments, Pearce was left to his own devices for over 2 hours, time in which, with servants in abundance to see to his needs, he relished the ability to order up a hot bath, hand over his uniform to be properly cleaned and pressed by people who knew their business, to shave on dry land, a much closer and less dangerous occupation than that carried out aboard ship, and to generally allow himself to be pampered. Once returned to him, his hat was as if new, his blue coat looked and smelt fresh, the buttons were polished to perfection, while the white of his breeches had been as well restored as the gleam on his shoe buckles, the footwear itself being polished to a high sheen. Hair washed and dressed, he felt like a new man when he rejoined his hostess. Unsure of her game, Pearce knew he had to be circumspect. There is a fine line between banter aimed at seduction and that which merely passes for engaging social interaction, and he was aware that Emma Hamilton was inclined to sail very close to the wind, though never once tipping over into open invitation. In the act of showing him Sir William's collection of virtue, he was presented with images of ancient sexual license, which could have rendered tongue-tied any normal person so exposed, and would have produced a pure fit of the vapours in an English matron. There were statues of copulating couples, but they paled beside the images which decorated the various tiles, urns, vases, drinking cups, and painted panels that made up the Hamilton collection, all dug up from the ruined cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. "As you can see, Lieutenant, the ancients lacked hypocrisy in such matters," she said, standing by a large bowl decorated with the images of a young, muscular male filleting a fellow who, by his looks and countenance, was twice the youth's age. "The same in our age is private and denied, though less so in these parts than in that fount of hypocrisy, London." Was she trying to shock him, or just seeking to elicit a reaction? And to what ultimate purpose? "It is a pity, my lady, that in your journey through Paris you did not pass by the cloistered walkways of the Palais Royal. I can assure you, had you done so, you would have found drawings to render these images tame, and they are as nothing to the writings the purveyors insist are satire, when in fact they are nothing but salacious denigration. The late Queen and the poor Princesse de Lamballe suffered particularly, which had much to do with their ultimate fate." Pearce was thinking, as he said those words, that Marie Antoinette, despite the horror of her recent fate, had suffered less indignity than her best friend. Poor Lamballe! Those scurrilous Palais Royal pamphleteers had been for years hinting at a sapphic relationship between the two, a quite stupid assertion in the view of anyone with a brain. If the Queen had suffered on the guillotine, her boon companion had had her head hacked off with several blows from a sword. It was then stuck on a pole and paraded through the streets of Paris. His assured description of that part of the French capital had Emma Hamilton looking at him in a quizzical fashion, which Pearce would have had to admit, if pressed, he enjoyed. He was telling her, in no uncertain terms, that if she saw before her a mere naval lieutenant, the bearer of the rank and the blue broadcloth coat was much, much more. "You know Paris well?" "I knew it, Lady Hamilton. I would not presume to say that I know it now." "You cannot leave my curiosity in limbo, sir." No memory of Paris was ever rendered by John Pearce without a degree of filtering, and it was the same now. While declining to mention his father, he did allude to his occupation of apartments very close to the Sorbonne, which, in terms of intellectual stimulation, had lost nothing in the change from monarchy to republic, quite the opposite, so that he had enjoyed the stimulus of discussion with students and teachers of that institution, people willing to debate the most esoteric ideas of human nature and governance, until the candles burnt out. The Paris of which he spoke was that which preceded the September massacres of '92, in which Lamballe had perished. It had fine places in which to eat, a carnival atmosphere as fête followed fête in celebration of what the inhabitants saw as freedom, and at every street corner the pitch of vendors selling tricolor cockades and bits of the Bastille, though most suspected the supply of original stone from that one-time royal bastion had long run out. There were occasional outbreaks of violent behaviour, but in the main the low elements that made up the Parisian mob stuck to their rookeries. It was the age of the pamphlet. They abounded, anti-clerical in tone, full of recommendations as to how the new state should be run. The famous salons were still active, overseen by clever women like Germaine de Stael and Madame Helvetius, being attended by the men who had led the country out of what they saw as a black past, places where no subject was to be avoided, though all engagements had to take place under the twin constraints of good manners and wit. "You met Madame de Stael?" "I was lucky enough to have an open invitation to her salon." Standing far enough away from John Pearce, and so able to look him up and down, she was seeing before her a much improved specimen from the fellow who had presented himself that morning. The look in her eye left him in no doubt of her opinion, that the open invitation of which he spoke had as much to do with his physical attributes as it had with any intellect he may possess. Yet it was not open admiration. There was no hint of hunger, merely recognition, and he was himself left in limbo by such scrutiny. "I am told she is remarkably unbecoming." "Milady, she makes up in her conversation for that which she lacks in physical attributes." "Clever, then." "How else would she attach to her person so many famous minds? Mirabeau was regular prior to his untimely death. The Abbé Sées, the Marquis de Condorcet, the defrocked bishop, Talleyrand, Régis de Cambaceres. I could go on. They say the loss of Mirabeau was fatal to the French monarchy. And I would respond that the French monarchy was fatal to itself. I sense radical opinions, sir. His reply, which was his deeply held view, had come out automatically, but to admit to the truth of that sentiment was not in the circumstances wise. Pearce could hardly declare a hatred of absolute monarchy, or even a limited love of the constitutional form when hoping to seek favours from a reigning queen. Yet neither would he lie. I would admit to an open mind. For the very first time since arriving, Pearce sensed that he had diminished himself in her eyes. The alteration was subtle, but it was there, and from a person who, so intimate with the Queen of Naples, wife to an absolute ruler, must be an unreconstructed lover of the monarchical establishment. An open mind is something to be much admired, I am sure, she said in response, though it lacked conviction. Since the part of the palazzo in which they were situated overlooked the street outside, the commotion of an arriving coach was clearly audible. The cries of the driver first urging his horses up the hilly street, next for those blocking his path to the gateway to clear it, as well as their less than good-natured response, followed by the groaning sound of the gate opening on hinges in need of oil. The quizzical look in Emma Hamilton's eye made Pearce curious as well. "I have a strange feeling, Lieutenant Pearce," she said with a face that registered neither joy nor disappointment, "that Sir William has returned." The door opened and a manservant gabbled something in Italian, but the word eccellenza was as plain as the gesture, which underlined that the mistress of the house had the right of it. John Pearce was thinking he would now never know what would have transpired after dinner, which was being prepared as they spoke. A beautiful woman, not averse to flirting, in the company of a man she clearly found attractive, plus the addition of food and wine to lower the constraints of a married woman. Her reputation was such that the odds lay in favour of an illicit tryst. That was until he recalled her mother. Whatever the inclinations of the principals, he was sure that Mrs. Cadogan would have ensured no slippage from the bounds of proper behaviour. "Sir William," said John Pearce, with a nod in place of a bow, "I come to you from Lord Hood with an urgent message." "Of this my wife has already informed me, sir." That was a statement which required consideration. Was there disapproval there? Had he let slip to her matters which the ambassador would have preferred to be kept secret? The man before him was elderly, in his 60s, Pearce guessed, but he still had about him the air and appearance of someone who had been handsome and elegant as a younger man. The eyes were lively, his face animated, though there was a very slight stoop to the shoulders, and the bony hooked nose, his most prominent facial feature, was stark in its lack of flesh. But he was slim, with no hint of a slipping belly, had strong thighs and a look that denoted keen intelligence. Then Sir William smiled, showing sound teeth, and that made what was an engaging countenance more so. "She tells me, sir, she wormed it out of you, and I dare say you felt it keenly. Do not think so, for few can withstand Lady Hamilton's charm when she chooses to exercise it." The pride was evident in the voice. This man had both a deep affection and respect for his young wife, which for a moment made Pearce feel like a scrub for the notion of toying with the idea of seduction. It was a thought which lasted only a moment. If this man knew anything, it would be the risks of marrying a woman 30 years his junior. "I was informed that you were not free to return to Naples, sir, and the matter is pressing. It seemed that being open with your wife was a necessity." "Never fear, young fellow, you did the right thing. And with that in mind, I have sent out invitations to a late supper for some of those to whom the Queen will turn once Emma has worked her magic. Thankfully, the Neapolitans are accustomed to eat as late as the Spaniards." The intention was that Lady Hamilton would arrange a private audience. The ambassador answered with a pensive look. "That is altered by my return. There is a protocol to these affairs, Lieutenant, and it is best for it to be observed. Tonight you will dine with important people who are committed to our cause in Toulon. Tomorrow, before the council meets, Emma will speak with the Queen and use her charms." Sir William smiled suddenly. "You will see those charms exercised this night as well, and to good effect. Given a fair wind, there might be enough positive opinions of the morrow to carry the matter forthwith." "That would be most gratifying, sir." The look he got for that interruption was far from benign, but it was not followed by a verbal rebuke. "And damned unusual, sir, let me tell you. Matters do not move swiftly in the court of Naples. In fact, in a race, the snail would have a distinct advantage. There will be siren voices against acceding to Lord Hood's request. But let us get the thing on the table, for without it being there, hope is useless." "I take it you see the need, sir." "It is my task to aid my country, sir. My own opinions of the matter have no relevance. Tell me, young fellow, what are your orders following on from this?" "Captain Digby is to proceed to Tunis, carrying dispatches, to rendezvous with Commodore Lindsay." "Is Captain Nelson not with him?" "He is, sir, aboard HMS Agamemnon." "That is a fellow you should watch, Lieutenant Pearce." He swung round to respond to the female voice, unaware that Emma Hamilton had entered the room, willing to admit that he barely knew Captain Nelson. "Sir William had marked him for greatness, and Sir William has an eye for such things." "Indeed I did. Spotted he was a remarkable fellow the moment we met." It was not Pearce's place to disagree, and while he had kind thoughts on Captain Nelson, a man he had first met on the deck of a merchant ship, he had no notion of the little fellow being remarkable. Quite the opposite. Pleasant, yes, a good officer probably, but anything other than that seemed to carry with it a touch of exaggeration. "Emma took to him as well. He has a fine grasp of essentials, does he not, my dear?" "He certainly has," she replied, in a warm way that had Pearce wondering if by essentials she meant the same as her husband. He then had to check himself. He was quite obviously, automatically tarring Emma Hamilton with the brush of her past, which was damned unfair. It was one of the strongest tenets of his father's life and teachings to never blacken a man or woman for what they had done, but to look to what they could do in the future. A Christian message, old Adam insisted, that most of his followers tended to forget. "Now, Lieutenant, you must excuse us, as our guests are arriving." The initial reception and introductions took place in the well-appointed drawing-room overlooking the bay, and since the sky had cleared there were lights twinkling all around, so the outline of the arc of the bay could be seen quite clearly. He was introduced to a dazzling array of Neapolitan worthies, 2 princes, Count this and that, a red-robed cardinal called Ruffo, but most importantly to Sir John Acton, the King's first minister by title, the Queen's closest adviser in fact. Pearce was dying to ask how an Englishman had ended up as the first minister of such a place, an Italian state ruled by a family of Spanish Bourbons, and on top of that, with a Habsburg queen. That it defied all logic mattered little. It was fact. Sharp-featured, with a compact body and a penetrating look in his small eyes, Acton was not immediately impressive. But he was a skilled interrogator, and Pearce found himself closely questioned about the state of affairs in Toulon. In truth, he had to struggle to answer in regard to matters of which he had only the sketchiest notion of the facts. A modicum of relief came with the food. Even Sir John Acton found it hard to quiz him while drinking and eating. Besides, he was engaged in conversation with others at the table, with Sir William Hamilton diplomatically rescuing Pearce from any possible gaffe by revealing too much to the Italian guests regarding Lord Hood's frustrations. He quite rightly passed on and got an appreciative clap for the Admiral's praise of the Neapolitan troops, whom he had insisted were, after the British redcoats, the most reliable under his command. A less flattering sally aimed at the Spaniards also seemed to go down well. Emma, the only woman present, departed the repast early, insisting on the need to prepare, leaving Pearce mystified as to what for. The men stayed drinking and talking for another half-hour, until finally Sir William rose and they all followed him into another large room with chairs and couches ranged around the outer walls. Leading Pearce to a chaise, Sir William confided in him that he was pleased with his performance at dinner. "All I want them to see is you as an affable, reliable sort, Pearce, and you have fended off too much detail, which is to the good. Tonight is about pleasure. The true matter will surface tomorrow. Now, ready yourself for the entertainment." Servants appeared and began to dim the numerous oil lamps, the candles being completely extinguished, plunging the room into a semi-darkness full of the babble of conversation. That ceased as another source of light appeared behind a set of diaphanous curtains, this while a lute and harpsichord struck up music of an ethereal quality. It was clever the way it was achieved, the slow increase in the strength of light as more and more lamps were uncovered to reveal the form of a woman, quite obviously Emma Hamilton, sitting in a classical pose, which Pearce was informed by a whisper to be Ariadne awaiting the return of Theseus. That in itself was not remarkable. It was what the increasing light from behind revealed that made it so. Emma Hamilton was dressed in loose garments made of the same material as the curtain, which clearly showed the shape of her body beneath. The outline of one breast, with a proud nipple, was delineated, as was the shape of her thigh, all of which produced appreciative murmurs from her male audience. The lights dimmed, conversation recommenced, but only for a couple of minutes. They rose again to show Emma in another pose, as Iphigenia being sacrificed, by the painter whose name Pearce could not recall, the cutout of a ghost behind her, and another body, no doubt a servant, standing over her with a long blade. Again the most striking feature was that which the lighting revealed. In this pose the wife of the British ambassador to the court of Naples, in her see-through garments, showed even more of her comely attractions than she had as Ariadne. The lights behind the curtain were dimmed and raised half a dozen times over the next hour, as Emma took various poses, and with nothing but the revealing garment, a shawl, and the odd vase cut out of board, recreated forms from classical literature. Each new figure was greeted with gasps of admiration and a ripple of polite applause, and it was certainly entertaining, with the final representation a chaste one of the Madonna and Child. What made Pearce curious was the purpose. Was it that Emma Hamilton had a desire to show herself off, to excite admiration for what was an exceedingly comely figure? Or was it part of Sir William's mission, a way of seducing the leading lights of Naples with near-naked representations involving his wife? In short, was the wily old rogue quite prepared to prostitute Emma's talents in order to gain a political advantage? Show over, the dimmed oil lamps were turned up to reveal a group of men, every one of whom was considerably older than John Pearce, looking somewhat flushed, so much so that he wondered at the state of his own complexion. Yet he knew that if some of those watching had found the show erotic, he had not. Interesting, yes, but more for what it said about the performer than anything else. "Well, Mr. Pearce," said Sir William, "have you ever seen the like?" "Never, sir," he replied truthfully. "Damned impressive, what?" "Exceedingly so. Now I will say good-bye to our guests, then you and I must have another glass or two while you tell me about yourself." "I hardly see that I am of much interest, Sir William." "You are to me, boy. I want to know why Lord Hood chose you to deliver a message that should have come, at the very least, in the person of a very senior captain." The Palazzo Sessa was quiet, the servants, excepting his host's valet, having finished their duties and gone to bed. Sir William had taken Pearce back to his room full of artefacts, and they were now sitting at a table drinking wine. Pearce, aware that he was getting steadily drunk and needed to guard his tongue, confining himself to telling the ambassador how he had come to be in the Navy, and especially how he had achieved his present rank. "So you met my good friend Georgie?" "You were acquainted with the King." Hamilton looked at Pearce as if he was a dolt, which was appropriate, given that no one would be an ambassador without meeting the monarch. "Sorry, sir. I meant outside your official position." "Ran riot with the randy sod many a time," Sir William said, suddenly wistful. "He was a rake-hell in those days, Pearce. Up every shift he could find, drunk to boot, and forever baiting the poor old watchman." "I have to say, sir, that does not sound like Farmer George." "That's just the point. He was rutting George in those days, my lad, before his grandpapa passed away. Talk about King Hal. No man ever changed more on his elevation, Pearce, from a boozer and womanizer to the staid fool he is now. If you're looking to extend the Shakespearean metaphor, I can stand in for Falstaff. Riotous friend 1 minute, then shut out the next. That German queen of his didn't help, and all those damned children. Man's a martinet with them, of course. He knows what he got up to in his youth, and he will not allow them the license to do the same." "I'm afraid I cannot find it in my heart to feel sorry for them, sir." "What?" Sir William responded, seemingly shocked. That was until reflection reasserted itself to level his mood. "No, I suppose not. The Prince of Wales is a fool, and so are half his brothers. York is as dense as the trees his papa talks to, though the one that got Hanover has ability. Times have changed, and not for the better, in my opinion. There's too much prudery about, and it all stems from Windsor Castle." Pearce waved a hand around to indicate the many objects hidden outside the pool of light in which they were sitting. "It would be true to say there is none in the Palazzo Sessa, sir." "And right, Pearce," said the old man, hauling himself to his feet. There was sadness in his eyes as he looked down at John Pearce, and his voice was slightly slurred, either through drink or sadness. "The King and Queen refused to receive my Emma, Pearce, and declined to attend the wedding, which is hurtful, us being such old friends. Dammy, there was a time he would have tried to bed her as soon as my back was turned." "Reprehensible, sir, given you were close friends." "Nonsense, Pearce. What fellow with blood in his veins would not harbour a wish to bed my Emma?" The look that followed that remark was one of amusement. It was as if he had read the mind of the young man before him, and, having seen what he had seen, was not in the least bit troubled. "May I ask one question, sir? What brought you back from the King's hunt?" "A note, Pearce, from Mrs. Cadogan, saying you had arrived, and the business was exceedingly urgent. Given the lady is the least likely to indulge in exaggeration, I knew it must be vital I return." The temptation to inquire if the note had said anything else had to remain just that. It was a question that could not be asked. The following morning Pearce was left to kick his heels with a copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, while the ambassador went for an audience with Queen Caroline. He had seen Lady Hamilton briefly, but she excused herself on the grounds that she had a lesson with her music teacher and a dozen letters to write, which was, in terms of an elbow in the ribs, at least gentle. Her mother, who seemed more amenable now that the master of the house was in residence, kept Pearce supplied with fruit and coffee until Sir William returned from the Palazzo Reale after an absence of 2 hours, looking cross, to inform the messenger that matters were at a stand. "It is ever thus in Naples, young fellow. Half the council are for sending more troops, half against. Half are on the fence, and there are those who might even want to bring what is already committed home." Pearce declined to point out that the addition exceeded the maximum, reasoning that Hamilton was talking reflectively. "How long before a decision, sir?" "Days, Pearce. Could be a week, and if the king gets involved, God only knows what will happen. My wife told you of the Queen's concerns." "She did. Trouble is, she has only a sliver of an idea if some of those advocating that we accede to Hood's request are doing so to get sent away the troops she needs to defend the throne of Naples. Soundings will have to be taken, careful ones at that, to discern everyone's motives." The thought of kicking his heels in this set of apartments did not appeal. There were undercurrents here, never mind in the audience chamber of the Palazzo Reale. Safer to be out of the orbit of such things. "Then might I suggest, sir, that I proceed with the ship to Tunis and deliver the necessary dispatches to Commodore Lindsay? It is no more than a few days' sailing, and matters will surely be resolved on my return." "If you wish," Sir William Hamilton replied, though without enthusiasm. "I had it in mind to take you along on a dig in the ruins of Pompeii. Young stalwart like you would come in handy with a shovel." Thinking of Michael O'Hagan, Pearce replied, "Sir, upon my return I will bring you a master of the art, and a fellow, when it comes to being stalwart, who is very much my superior." "So be it. But you cannot depart until I have written to Captain Nelson, and I know my wife would want you to take a letter from her as well." Chapter 16. "I have to say it sounds to me reprehensible," Henry Digby insisted, having been given a description of what Lady Hamilton called her attitudes. "But what can you expect from a woman like that?" "Do not denigrate her so readily, sir. The lady has many accomplishments." "To which most decent fellows would not wish to be exposed." John Pearce was amused by that remark. Most decent fellows, as Digby termed them, faced with a creature like Emma Hamilton, and in receipt of an invitation to bed her, would be out of their breeches in a flash. He recalled her remark about hypocrisy, and looking at his superior as they paced the windward side of the quarter-deck, in the act of digesting their recent dinner, he was sure he was in the presence of that very article. Was there also a touch of pique? Digby had not been invited to visit the Palazzo Sessa, and had not been witness to Lady Hamilton's charms. "I seem to recall you, sir, telling me of your visits to a Portsmouth boarding house as a midshipman." "It shames me now to admit to it, but there is, of course, a world of difference, Mr. Pearce." "Forgive me, sir, if I fail to see it." Digby should have withdrawn then, but so certain was he in his convictions that he ploughed on, and, as is so often the case in such a discussion, his words tended to undermine his position rather than support it. "I do not, and have never sought to profess sainthood, Mr. Pearce. I have needs as much as the next fellow." "Yet you have argued with me in favour of an all-seeing God," Pearce thought, wondering how anyone outside a rabid papist, who had the escape route of the confessional, could advance such a proposition. If paying a whore for her services was a sin, how could a man professing deep religious faith justify it? And why was the sin greater in the woman rewarded than the fellow paying? "I have, as you so readily point out," Digby continued, "been a visitor to various places of entertainment, though that is very much in the past, in my youth, so to speak, and in the company of my fellow mids, all hearty and red in tooth and claw. I will not pretend to be any different, and I have, in a reduced state of sobriety, taken comfort where it was on offer. You must comprehend the circumstances, Mr. Pearce, of a very young sailor who has been at sea for a long time, who has coin to disburse, and has partaken of a good deal of drink. "Then all Lady Hamilton has done in her past, and as far as I can discern it is anecdotal rather than known fact, is to provide the very same service which you admit to having enjoyed." "I don't know the lady," Digby protested. "I referred to the institution rather than the person." "But don't you see, Mr. Pearce, while I do not condemn her for her past life, an unchristian thought, I cannot but wonder at her present estate, and the activities you have described. Damn it, she's wedded to the King's ambassador." "So as long as a woman of questionable morality keeps her place and satisfies the needs of men, she is to be commended." Digby gave a dismissive laugh. "No, no, Mr. Pearce, you cannot trap me like that. I do not commend whoredom. I condemn it, as any right-thinking man should." Pearce could not resist it, even although he knew it would spark his superior into anger. "Except Jesus, sir, who I seem to recall was very forgiving of a woman he became exceedingly close to, one Mary Magdalene." "Mr. Pearce, the way you use the word close is bordering on the blasphemous." "How my father would have berated you," Pearce thought. But then Adam Pearce had spent his life trying to disabuse other men of their dearly held beliefs on the simple grounds that they were deluded. Where son parted company with parent was in the belief that such opinions could be altered by argument. In his experience, few men succumbed to another opinion enough to alter their own, even when what they were propounding was demonstrably absurd. "I have met the lady, sir, and I think had you too done so—" "Might I remind you, sir, that I was not even in receipt of an invitation?" "Had you been," Pearce insisted, "and had you met her, I am sure your attitude would be altered. She may come from a questionable background, but she speaks French, German, and Italian, plays the harpsichord with some expertise, is much esteemed in her sagacity by her husband, and on conversational terms with the Queen of Naples." "Which," Digby asserted, "tells you all you need to know about the proprieties as they are observed in these waters." "Deck there! Sail ho!" came a cry from the masthead. "How many does that make today, Mr. Pearce?" "A round dozen, sir." "Where away?" Digby shouted. "Dead astern, Captain." "Shall I, sir?" asked Pearce, pointing to the shrouds in expectation of another trip aloft. "Good God, no, Mr. Pearce," Digby replied, as if such a notion was absurd. "Send Harbin." A shouted conversation with the fellow in the tops established all he had seen was the flash of a topsail on the rise, with no notion of what kind of vessel it was. Harbin could add little, and given that night fell early in the Mediterranean, there was an increasingly diminishing chance of another sighting. The mere display of a sail in these waters meant nothing, given that south of Sicily, in the wide channel between that island and the North African shore, lay one of the globe's busiest and most constrained sea lanes. All the trade to and from the Levant passed this way. So it was only by habit that Digby, seeing the sun set in the west, ordered the drummer to beat to quarters. It was his way, and that of many in the Navy, a ritual repeated at dawn and dusk, good practice for the crew and a sound precaution, especially at first light. When darkness came, he stood the men down, and with the course set, and the conditions being benign, a steady northeasterly Grecale breeze wafting them along at 5 knots, the watch coming on duty expected to have it easy, just as the captain anticipated a full night's sleep. John Pearce, who had the morning watch, shaking him from a dream in which he was consorting with an imagined woman, an ambassador's wife of uncommon comeliness, clad only in a shawl that revealed a great deal of naked flesh, came as a shock. Digby was on the quarter-deck in just over a minute, his boat-cloak thrown over his night attire. The lack of stars and moonlight indicated the cloud cover had increased, creating a Stygian blackness outside the arc of lanterns rigged on HMS Farron. He was also wondering if his first lieutenant was imagining things, something not unknown on a dark night on a wide-open sea, vaguely aware as he turned over these thoughts that Mr. Neame had joined them. "Tell me about the sound again, Mr. Pearce." "A clanging, sir, metal on metal." "Repeated?" "No, but it was clear the one time it was heard." "Who else heard it?" "The quartermaster reacted, sir, but when I asked him to confirm my suspicions, he was not sure enough to do so." Digby stood for a full minute, nose in the air, as if sniffing the wind. It was clear he had grave doubts that Pearce had heard anything, and he had orders to proceed to Tunis with all dispatch. But set against that was the fear of the unknown. His course had been set in full daylight and held true now. If there had been a noise close enough to be heard, there should also be some evidence of a ship, pinpricks of light from their lanterns. But there was nothing. "I need your opinion, Mr. Pearce." "And I, sir, do not feel qualified to give one." The exasperation was plain in Digby's voice. "That will not do. If you apprehend danger, you must say so." "I am at a loss to be certain, sir, but I think you once said to me that discretion is the better part of valour." Pearce would never know if those words decided Digby, given he had been ruminating for some time. When he spoke again, his orders were crisp. "Put men on all the ship's lights. I want them doused on my command, but quietly, so it will need bodies to pass it on. Mr. Neame, as soon as the lights are out, I want to come about on the opposite course to that we are sailing now." "Into the wind, sir." "Aye, but under easy sail. Mr. Pearce, the crew is to be told, no talking, no sound. Let us retrace our course and see if we have anything in our wake." "Thank you, sir." "For what, Mr. Pearce?" "Your trust?" Digby gave a slight chuckle. "It is a poor captain who fails to trust his officers, sir." That Henry Digby was a bit of a weather vane did not shock John Pearce, but he did wonder that such a swing in mood seemed normal to his captain. There was no time to ponder on such curiosities. He had to get things organised. It took time to get everyone in place, with no haste being shown. The men were instructed to amble to the lanterns, the great light on the stern post, the twin lamps on either end of the main yard. Pearce himself was beside the binnacle, and the killing of that light was the signal to douse the others, including those below the ship's companionways. If they did not go out simultaneously, it only covered a trio of seconds to plunge the ship into darkness. From below, the watch waiting to adjust the sails felt their way to their stations, not too difficult on a ship with which they were familiar. The command to let fly the sheets was a whisper, and as the spikes were pulled to release the pressure on the falls, the quartermaster swung the wheel hard a larboard, bringing HMS Farron up into the wind. Getting the sails sheeted home in silence, yards braced right round, was not easy for men accustomed to sing hearty while hauling hard, and many a tar received a soft kick from a shipmate to shut them up. Making hardly any way, the ship was now on a northwest heading, everyone standing by to reverse the actions just carried out and get them back on their old course. On the quarterdeck, Pearce and Neame were standing on one bulwark, Harben and Digby on the other, while Pearce had sent sharp-eyed Charlie Taverner to the stern post, first as lamp-darser, then as an ear and an eye. He had to tiptoe over the deck to tell Pearce what he heard. The sound of wind whistling through rigging, of water running down a ship's bow, the soft slap of those same bows hitting waves, which was a strange thing to be aware of at a ship's stern. Pearce immediately did what Charlie should have done, and informed his captain. It was sheer luck that had the cloud cover break for a moment to the east, lighting up the ghostly shape of what had to be a warship of considerably bigger displacement than their vessel, and leaving HMS Farron safe against a dark background. In the few seconds it was visible, it was like that object of a sailor's superstitious nightmares, the ship of the dead, crewed by skeletons, once men but now stripped of all flesh, mere skulls instead of faces, sockets instead of eyes, yet ones that once they took your gaze, sent you into the arms of old Nick himself. The vision came and went so quickly that many a common seaman believed it to be a phantasm. Digby reckoned different. Sailing without lights on the same course as he, it could only be an enemy. "Mr. Neame," he called softly after a gap of 10 minutes, "put us right before the wind. I want a bit of westing prior to first light. Mr. Pearce, with as little noise as possible, get the cannon loaded and run out." The next 2 hours were nerve-wracking, for in the blackness many an eye was sure they saw things, and not just the sails of a ship. One loud scream came from a tar who was sure he saw the face of his old mother, long deceased, a scream that ended abruptly when Michael O'Hagan belted the sod round the ear. It was a time for the blue-water credulous to claim a clear sight of mermaids, for one of a more arcane bent to insist he saw the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse thundering across the sky, the noise of their hooves being as imagined as the fancy. An occasional break in the cloud cover would throw a sharp beam of moonlight onto the surface of the sea, quickly extinguished, and in that the men of the ship could observe all sorts of visions. But what they could not see, officers and seamen alike, and that included young Harbin sat right on the cross-trees, was any sign of that ghostly vessel, so that as the glass was turned, without the sound of a bell to mark it, the whisperings of the superstitious had half the crew convinced that they were doomed, and daylight would never come. It did, of course, to reveal a sea devoid of any other vessel. "Mr. Neame, shape me a course for Tunis. Let us be about what is intended."
"We did see a ship, sir, did we not?"
"It would never do, Mr. Neame," in a voice that failed to radiate certainty, "to doubt the evidence of our own eyes." The North African coast began as a line of bluish haze on the horizon, caused by the heat of the land, and it was a long time before individual features began to manifest themselves, by which time the long promontory of Cape Bon was clear on their larboard quarter, and soon they were abreast of the site of ancient Carthage. The deep bay with Tunis at its base formed a natural harbour of great strength, a dangerous place for an attacking force if the wind was foul, and as the line of the shore began to show clearly, the lookouts on HMS Farran could also observe the masts of numerous ships. The news soon came to the quarterdeck that within a cable's length of Lindsay's flagship, HMS Alcide, lay a pair of French warships, and, so close inshore they were near to being beached, a large convoy of French, heavily laden merchant vessels. Behind that lay the town itself. Inside the stout walls a mass of buildings, white mixed with dun-brown, seeming to rise one upon the other, so crowded were they, with the tall towers of the minarets rising like spears from within. The smell that came off the land was that of burnt earth tinged with human detritus, and soon as they approached the point at which the British squadron lay at anchor, firing off a salute to the Commodore's blue pennant, they found themselves sailing through the filth as well as the odour of an over-occupied port in sore need of a raging storm to carry its muck out to sea. The order for Digby to proceed to Alcide was hardly necessary given his mission, and the boat was in the water before his ship had completely lost way, Pearce being left to see to her being anchored. That completed, the Premier undertook the next task, which was to keep an eye on the numerous boats which had come alongside. The whole ship's crew were occupied, as far away from him as possible, buying everything, while calling to alluring female creatures seeking to tempt them into transgression. Digby had been quite strict on that score. While some captains turned a blind eye to the smuggling on board of local whores, something inclined to turn the lower deck into a place of riot, he would not stand for it, and any man found to have disobeyed, he had already warned, would be flogged. Pearce, having a jaundiced view of his fellow humans, and in particular of sailors, knew that sanction would not prevent them trying, half suspecting that bearding the captain in that game, getting one over on him, was as important to some of the crew as getting their leg over a female. "Mr. Harbin," he called, seeing the crowd at the bows, "please make sure that no women or drink come aboard from those boats." "Will there be drink, sir, them hereabouts being Mussulmen?" "I think you will find, Mr. Harbin, that where there is money to be made, religious scruples are soon discarded. Try to confine the men to food and trinkets." After a decent interval, he ordered the boats to stand off and instituted a search of the ship, which had nothing to do with his own morality and everything to do with his duty to his captain. Even in such a small vessel, he knew that tars were capable of hiding things that to a normal mind bordered on the impossible. and care had to be employed on his exploration to avoid noticing other articles forbidden. One man's grog saved up for a week in order to get drunk, sets of dice or cards, and personal possessions that smacked of past larceny. Again, this had nothing to do with his own set of standards. He knew, as did every naval officer, that sailors, when it came to the articles of war and statutes by which they were ruled, were experts in the article of contravention, just as he knew that to seek to punish every one of those misdeeds was impossible. Certainly the men must be governed, for if they were not, mayhem would ensue, and John Pearce was willing to apply sanctions if they were warranted, never mind that it went against his own inclinations. The men expected it, and he'd soon realized they would have no respect for a blue coat that did not apply it. A ship of war was too dangerous a place for laxity. Yet it had to be balanced with good sense. Too harsh a discipline would be repaid by sullen observance of orders. Too nosy an officer might struggle in a tight situation to be supported. Perhaps on larger vessels with crews in the 600 to 900s, the articles of war could be applied in full. To his mind, it would be fatal on something the size of HMS Farron, at present carrying a complement of no more than 100. A contented crew meant a compact ship that sailed and fought well. Thus that very necessary object, the blind eye, was well employed. It was therefore unfortunate that the person he found, his back to him, holding up a goatskin of wine, a stream of which must be entering his wide-open mouth, was Michael O'Hagan, and, beyond him, the dim outline of a recumbent woman. Crouched below the deck beams of the forepeak, almost doubled over, Pearce watched him for several seconds, hating what he saw, and also wondering why Michael had not been warned. There had been enough scuffling and movement ahead of him so far to let him know that men were being alerted to his progress, and either hiding things or getting away from his likely route. Yet his best friend aboard had been left exposed. Had Michael been set up to be discovered? Set up to find out what he would do? Their close association was no secret, and somehow men had made sure that the people who would certainly have given out a warning were not there to do so. For the first time it seemed to Pearce there might be some resentment on the ship. He had never used his position to favour his pelicans, but the appreciation of that lay very much in the eye of the beholder, so it was quite possible envy was present where there was no real cause. These thoughts induced in him a sense of gloom. He was well aware that an absolute knowledge of how he stood with the crew was not possible, but he had reckoned himself, if not popular, at least tolerated. What he was seeing now, in the couple of seconds before he spoke, was the truth. To many men he was still an unknown, and perhaps, given the way he had come by his rank, seen as something of an impostor. In short, there were those on the lower deck of this ship who thought of him in the same way as half the officers in Hood's fleet. "Belay that, Michael," he said softly. The big Irishman spun round, his square face registering the shock of being caught in the act. But Pearce noticed the look that tried to see beyond him, and the confusion that engendered. O'Hagan had expected to be told if he was at risk, expected to have plenty of time to hide both his illicit drink and his whore. Pearce held out his hand and took the goatskin off Michael, watching as his face registered a hint of refusal, a moment of bewilderment, and finally an expression of sadness. "Michael, I need to see this creature off the ship. Sure, I have dropped us in the steep tub, John boy, have I not?" "Me more than you, I think." O'Hagan nodded slowly, as what had happened became clear. Michael was not educated, but he was no fool. He knew he had been set up to fall, and he knew why. "Mr. Harbin!" Pearce called loudly, while making a gesture to the woman to get ready to depart. The time which it took for the mid to appear, and the woman to be escorted away, had clearly given Michael time to think, and he looked at a man he thought of as a friend, with eyes full of sadness. "Well, John boy, it seems as if matters will just have to go their own road. I have done wrong by the ways of this damned navy, and no amount of saints will see me off the due reward." I cannot ignore it, Michael. The good of the ship. Who let you find me? That, John boy, is for me to know, not you. I just hope. Pearce could not say the word, could not mention Charlie Taverner. They as a pair went back to a time when Pearce did not know them, and had a rivalry over that serving wench in the Pelican Tavern. For all he knew, they might have clashed since, given they were far from being two peas in a pod. They were different, very much so, as was immature Rufus. But would that extend to such as this? It weren't anyone you or I'd call a friend, never fear. There's a price to pay, Michael. O'Hagan nodded. And it must be borne. Pearce fingered his blue officer's coat. I could give this up. Mother of God, don't even think on it. It's the only hope we have of salvation. Pearce held out his hand and took the goatskin. Feeling it and taking note, it was half empty. The wine had probably yet to fully affect Michael, but surely it would, and Pearce knew him to be a dangerous drunk, a man who, inebriated, thought of nothing except loud boasting and fisticuffs. It was in that condition he had first met him, and had he not ducked his head, it would have been knocked off. If the drink did affect him, he would be a dangerous man in the next couple of hours, quite capable, in his anger, of being left exposed to massively compound what was a relatively minor offence. Michael, I'm going to get Mr. Harben to lock you in the cable tier. Jesus, John boy, that is harsh. Pearce held up the goatskin. Believe me, friend, I'm doing it for your own good. You've had a fair measure of this, and once it takes you over, I fear you might kill someone. And know this, Michael, when the captain returns, I cannot plead for you. Jesus, John boy, if you had as much trouble in your life as I have, you would not let that get you down. Chapter 17. If Henry Digby was aware of Pearce's discomfort in the article of punishing Michael O'Hagan, it was well hidden, he being more taken with the results of his interview with the Commodore. Matters are at a stand, Mr. Pearce, and I do not think the man in charge of negotiations knows what to do. He has seen the bay twice without any progress. You've yet to tell me what he is trying to achieve, sir. Is it not obvious? Lindsay is seeking to close the North African ports to the French, thus denying them both stores and an anchorage for their warships, as well as convoys such as that currently tied up in the bay. Digby's eyes lit up then with undisguised greed. From Smyrna, by all accounts, and worth a fortune. Would it not be just the finest thing if we were here when it was seized? Is it about to be? In the balance, as I fear Commodore Lindsay lacks the passion for a bold stroke. Not that the orders I have delivered, from what I can gather, allow him much latitude. He wants the Bay to make the decision, so he seeks to persuade him it is in his interest to side with England. Naturally, the French press him with the opposite view. Anyway, we are to dine with him today, preparatory to another visit to the old fellow on the morrow. I must take a boat over to Agamemnon, sir. I have letters for Captain Nelson from Sir William and Lady Hamilton. Have you indeed? Digby replied, in a manner that suggested Pearce had just admitted to being the bearer of the plague. I shouldn't bother. You'll be at table with him at 3 o'clock. And O'Hagan? Can't wait till the morrow. I take it the boatswain has been told to ready a cat? No, sir, Pearce replied, aware that he had forgotten that particular naval custom. Each flogging had made for the occasion its own special instrument of punishment. I should see to that, Mr. Pearce. Then it is best bib and tucker for dinner with Lindsay. He's Lord Hood's brother-in-law, don't you know? I confess, Pearce replied gloomily, that I was unaware of the connection. Digby dropped his voice, not quite to a whisper, but close. Explains why he's so favoured, Pearce. Not for the wife's brother to be at anchor off Toulon, or manning a battery in some dusty redoubt. No, he gets all the plums. Is this a plum, sir? Well, not the way he described it to me. Digby then let a guffaw and added, More akin to a plum stone. Do you smoke it, Pearce? Plum stone. "Droll, sir, very droll," Pearce replied, as Digby's shoulders shook at the acuity of his own wit. "You can't say out, Charlie," Latimer insisted, his aged leathery face intense. "Captain laid down the rule, and Michael broke it." Charlie spoke quietly, sitting in the very same forepeak in which the Irishman had been found, but there were ears nearby he did not want twitching. "He could have been forewarned. There were shipmates around to sound off for him." Blubber Booth put a hand on the complainant's shoulder as Latimer nodded the truth of that point. "Michael scares a few folk, Charlie, him being as big as he is. It don't always serve to make you loved." "Christ," Rufus protested, "he's as gentle as a lamb." That got the youngster a hard look from Charlie Taverner, who was wondering why Rufus could not recall the Michael O'Hagan who had got drunk nearly every night in the Pelican and was wont to threaten all and sundry with his ham-like fists for any real or imagined slight. "A lamb he ain't, Rufus, if you recall." "Has he raised a fist to anybody aboard this ship?" the youngest Pelican demanded. "He don't have to, Rufus," Blubber insisted. "Certain he's a fountain of good humour, and he's good mates to us here. But there are those aboard this barque who are afeard of Michael, even if he has never given him just cause." "In the name of the Lord, why?" "You're not much more than a nipper, Rufus," Latimer said, but in a kindly way, which deflected the young man's natural resentment. "You see's matter from the age you are, but me and Blubber here has been at sea for a year or two more than thee, and we have seen enough to be a bit on the up when it comes to seeing things straight. Fear is a funny thing, mates, and it's made real bad by being right in your face. You two would say there is not a man-jack aboard has aught to fear from Michael, but he's a big man with big hands, and all aboard have heard what he's like as a bare-knuckler. You recall his bouts on Leander, and how he won 'em." "He did get a feller on brilliant and all," said Charlie. "As we told you, a right bully boy called Devonogh who got his comeuppance and no error." "Word has got round. Michael O'Hagan, for all his good humour, is not a man to cross if you want to stay whole. So there'll be men on this barque who'll laugh at his jokes, funny or no, who get out of his way as he walks to a duty, and for all his cheer they'll not be happy in themselves for their caution. Did he not clip that bugger who says he saw his dead mother? And that takes no account of the way we talked to John Pearce, who was never favoured any man that I can see, but that too can be taken amiss. Fear and being jealous of a supposed advantage is a powerful blend." "How many?" asked Rufus. "It only takes a few," Blubber Booth replied. "The problem is, Michael might well know who they are and suspect they're a hand in him being had up, so the likes of us have to stay his fists if he wants to get his vengeance." "Why?" demanded a clearly angry Charlie Taverner, who would not admit to having been in fear of Michael himself, and in the way just described. "They deserve what's coming to them." "They might, but that's not the point." Latimer made to move, coming up from his haunches with his face showing the strain it was having on his old knees. "If we don't, our Irish friend will spend every day for a week at the grating, and I can tell you the result of that will be an end to any good humour Michael might have natural. I've seen it all afore, a good man turned bad by too much of the lash."
End of CD 7. CD 8.
John Pearce was, as Digby had described, in his best bib and tucker, which, having been so expertly cleaned in the Palazzo Sessa, tended to make his captain's outfit, being still in much the same state in which it had returned from Villefranche, look a trifle drab. That Digby had noticed he did not doubt, but he said nothing, seemingly in too good cheer from going aboard a flag vessel in the office of a master and commander. "You have your letters?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Good, good," Digby responded, heading for the gangway. "Mr. Harbin, you have the deck." The two officers clambered down into a cutter in which the boat crew had been dandified, told to put on fresh checked shirts that they would normally have kept for a run ashore, all with the same red neckerchiefs and clean ducks. "Now row steady, lads," Digby called. "Ply even. The good name of the ship rests on a smooth crossing." Looking at Digby, John Pearce felt he was gifted with a peek at the future man, full of pomp and pride, though not so much as to be a booby, happy in his rank and delighted at the invite. Digby's face flushed with pleasure as, approaching the side of the third-rate, the coxswain called out, "Fair on!" in a loud bellow, and he looked at Pearce with a piercing glare as if to say, "Damn your Hamiltons, this is true honour." That colour deepened as he was piped aboard with all the ceremony due a ship's captain, where there was a line of marines to elevate Digby's mood further, though the job of actually receiving him had been allotted to the Premier. "Captain Hallowell asks that you join him in his cabin for an early refreshment." "Delighted!" Digby cried, and he and Pearce followed the fellow along the main deck and up the companionway, his shoulders square and his head held high. Salutes from the marine sentry Digby greeted with a jaunty hand near his hat. Then there was a servant waiting to take that from both officers, until finally they were shown into the sanctum of the main cabin. "Gentlemen," the captain cried upon them entering, and once Digby had done the honours, John Pearce found himself shaking the hand of an officer nearly as tall as Michael O'Hagan, one who could not give of his full height for the overhead deck beams. He also had a voice to match his stature. "Ben Hallowell at your service." Colonial, thought Pearce, hearing the twang of the Americas in the voice. "Steward, a drink for our guests," Hallowell cried again, his voice booming in a face that was a picture of rubicund good cheer. "You need a few drams, sir, to face a dinner with a Commodore." In the background they could hear the whistles and stamping of another arrival, and Hallowell cried with mock alarm, "Damn me, I have missed Nelson coming on board." "Still," he added with another beaming smile, "there was never a fellow less likely to take offence." Within half a minute Nelson was in the cabin, his small hand and frame dwarfed by that of Hallowell. He took the thump on the back well, for it was delivered with force, his smile alone fading slightly to register the effect. "For all love, Ben, belay that," he moaned, with a somewhat nasal tone in his voice, muffled even more by the appearance and employment of a large handkerchief. "I have only one small skeleton to be going on with, and enough diseases contained in it to fill yours." "Captain Digby, allow me to present to you Captain Horatio Nelson, who thinks himself prey to every malaise of mankind. He is, of course, in rude good health." "If only it were so, Ben," Nelson responded with a snuffle and a rub, before acknowledging Digby. In being introduced to John Pearce, the little captain peered hard at him. "I've seen you before, Lieutenant, I'm sure." "I think not, sir," Pearce replied. He was unwilling to admit that the man was right. Pearce had met Nelson briefly in the English Channel when the captain came aboard the merchantman on which he and his companions were going north, to what they thought was freedom instead of a second impressment. Nelson was on his way south to join the fleet at Lisbon. "No, I never forget a face. It will come to me." "You may have heard of Lieutenant Pearce, sir," said Digby, "rather than met him. He was the fellow elevated by His Majesty for the action with Centurion." "Are you, by God? Then I want you next to me at dinner, sir, so you can tell me all about it." Digby was so busy being pleased with that response, he failed to see the glare he got from his Premier. Much as he felt he had been grilled like some morsel of food on a hot plate, Pearce could not find it in him to take offence at Nelson. There was an almost childlike innocence to his enthusiasm, and it was telling that all the while Pearce was relating, with the necessary degree of modesty, how he and the crew of HMS Griffin had helped a 50-gun man-of-war to best a French 74, the handkerchief which he was so wont to employ had stayed in his pocket, and no hint was forthcoming of any malaise. Of course, the whole table had listened to his tale, which had Digby, drinking with a little more gusto than the rest, thumping the board and crying, "Hear him! Hear him!" When Pearce finished, his superior addressed his neighbour. "My compliments to you, Captain Nelson. You have a rare gift for getting disclosure. I have sailed with Mr. Pearce for more than 2 months, and that is the first time he has told the tale whole." Lindsay, by far the least garrulous soul at the table, gave Pearce a quizzical look, so direct it demanded a response. As I have already said, gentlemen, we had the good fortune to be in the right place at the right time, and that must be laid at the door of the man who commanded the vessel. As well as that, I have already said how the senior members of the crew aided me in making the necessary decisions. If honour is due, that it is theirs by right. Pearce was tempted to mention Latimer by name, who had been the most forthcoming in that role, but he feared to do so unless it led him into an assertion that he held dear, the notion that the Navy was often officered by fools and served by men of the lower deck who were frequently wiser by far. I, for one, am not surprised, Mr. Pearce. To my mind, there is no nobler creature than those tars who serve on His Majesty's ships and vessels. Of all Lindsay's guests, Nelson seemed most affected by the wine he was drinking, and that level of hyperbole only served to underline it. Pearce reckoned him as a man with a light head, which generally led to strong sentiments, if not accurate expression. "I cannot give you nobility, hoary," boomed Hallowell, voicing the very thought Pearce was harbouring. "I will give you application and courage, but to assert that the men who serve on our vessels are noble is pure rot." Nelson beamed, and so eager was he to get in his sally that he spoke quickly enough to slur slightly. "I bow to you in that, Ben, and say without peradventure you are a living example of the proposition." "Which I am bound to second," said Lindsay with a wan smile, "just as I add my compliments to you, Mr. Pearce, on your success." That was a rare statement from someone so elevated, indeed from any naval officer. Most, he felt, when free from the prejudice of actual dislike, tended to condescend to him for being merely lucky, men who struggled to conceal their jealousy, and to that was added the sheer bitterness of anyone of high rank that their king had overturned the custom and practice of the service. Lindsay's brother-in-law certainly did not share the sentiment, but it would not be wise to say so. The Commodore seemed a man of serious mien, with a slightly doleful countenance which suggested he felt the weight of his responsibilities. While enjoying the banter between his two post-captains, he had been restrained in his response, and was, as Pearce saw and Digby did not, somewhat pained by the outre outbursts of the latter. If Digby was trying to impress him, he was going the wrong way about it. Looking at his host as the conversation moved on to something they called the Mortella Tower, Pearce wondered if he, too, felt he was subject to some of the same brickbats. Being related to the C&C would mean that no one would grant him the slightest degree of competence to justify his blue pennant. Many would assert that such a promotion would come from his being related to Hood. Pearce could not help conjuring up, when he thought of naval officers in the mass, an image of bickering fishwives, and it was while he was ruminating on that he was caught out by a question from Lindsay. "I believe, Mr. Pearce, you sailed round Corsica prior to my attempt to subdue the forces on the Northern Cape. Did you observe any such towers? I believe there is more than one of similar design." "Forgive me, sir, I was in Cloud Cuckoo Land," hooted Nelson, blue eyes alight in a way which demonstrated quite clearly he was inebriated. "If you had seen one, sir," Lindsay added with a mere flicker of a frown at Nelson, "you would know of what I speak. I am certain if you had attacked one, you would share the view that they are formidable." "Damned hard to damage with round shot," added Hallowell, "being circular in their construction. Shot skims off if it don't hit dead true, and the damn places are built so well even a ball smack on the face of the stonework does little damage. Cost us 60 men wounded and dead when we tried to subdue it." Lindsay's gloomy face suddenly became animated by a degree of fury. "Which we would have succeeded in doing had the Corsicans kept their part of the bargain. That tower needed to be attacked from land at the same time as we engaged the guns from seaward. But where in creation was the so-called Corsican army? That damned old flanneler Paoli in his letters promised much and delivered absolutely nothing, leaving us exposed." "Pasquale Paoli?" Pearce asked. "That's him!" Lindsay had responded with such venom that Pearce declined to say what had been on his lips, to mention that he knew a bit about Paoli. He had heard the story of the hero of the Corsican resistance to French rule from his father's friend James Boswell, the biographer of Dr. Johnson. He had only been a child, but the Laird of Auchinleck had made Paoli sound admirable, noble of countenance and modest in his manner, and, thanks to Boswell's writings, lionized by London society. He was clearly not seen in that light at this board, so it was again fortunate that the talk had moved on, and his opinion was not sought. Hallowell was describing in more detail the assault on the Mortella Tower, until with an almost abrupt gesture Lindsay brought matters round to the problem he presently faced: how to deal with that damned rogue, the Bay of Tunis. Lindsay had tried to get the Bay to impound the French vessels, both warships and merchantmen, something the ruler of Tunis was reluctant to do for the very good reason that such an action would make him an enemy of France. Thinking on it, as the conversation bounced back and forth, listening to the points made, and being less partisan than his fellow diners, Pearce could understand what the fellow was thinking. The British he would see as a temporary presence in this part of the world. The French, in contrast, were permanent northern neighbours, distant only by a few days' sailing. At present, Britannia was struggling to contain the revolution. If they failed, retribution would fall on anyone who aided them. At the same time, the British were presently close by with a powerful fleet, one which, if so employed, could make life very difficult for the lord of a trading port. Hence his preference for neutrality. "The fellow's no more than a successful Cretan pirate," Lindsay said loudly, "but he has enough influence at Constantinople to get and keep his office." "You know my view, sir," said Nelson, who now became animated enough to seemingly overcome his inebriation. "We should act with decision." "Which, Captain Nelson, will surely add to our enemies at a time when we are seeking allies." The formality of that response, which was a hint to Nelson that the view he had just expounded was unwelcome, went right over the man's head. "The Bay, sir, cannot be said to be our friend." "Lord Hood would wish, if he cannot be that, for him to be kept from becoming an ally of France, even if they cut off the king's head. You were present, Captain Nelson, when the Bay reminded us that we had at one time done the same." "You know I esteem our Lord Hood, but he is not here, sir." "We are, and I believe bold action will carry the day. We should board and take those French frigates, secure the Smyrna convoy's prizes, and bribe the Bay with half the profits from the sale of what they are carrying." "I have said it before, Captain Nelson, that my orders are quite specific, and they have been reinforced by the dispatches brought to me by Captain Digby. The problem is not simply here. Attack the ships in the Bay, and we may well set the whole Mussulman world of the Mediterranean against us. Constantinople will not take kindly to us being high-handed. Might I remind you, we are talking of the very people who, in the religious connection, hold the land within 12 miles of Gibraltar." "But—" Nelson got no further, as Lindsay cut him off with the words, "I think I have made the position clear, Captain." Nelson actually produced a pout that took years off him, making him, with his unlined skin and blonde, untidy hair, look quite youthful. "I defer to you, sir. I know the decision is not an easy one." "Thank you, Captain," Lindsay replied, probably well aware that the words did not match the feelings, which was very evident in Nelson's expression. "Whatever, we must go ashore again on the morrow and see if we can get him to change his mind." Pearce had quite deliberately kept the letters until he could get Nelson on his own. It was no business of anyone else if he was communicating with the Hamiltons. He might be open about the connection, but it was his prerogative to be discreet if he wished. "Why, thank you, Mr. Pearce." Nelson took the letters and caressed the seals, very obviously pleased. "You met the ambassador?" "I did, sir, a most elegant gentleman." "Oh, he's more than that, Mr. Pearce. The fellow has a sharp brain, and that goes double for Lady Hamilton." There was a look in the little captain's eye then, a gleam that tempted Pearce to say more. With him still feeling the effects of the wine he had consumed, he might reveal that his admiration for the lady extended to more than her brain. Just as he decided against it, the matter being none of his concern, Nelson went on, "You have no idea how kind she was to my stepson, Josiah. The lad knows nothing of the world, Mr. Pearce, locked away as he has been, when not at school, in Norfolk. To a young man who sees a trip to the King's Lynn feast or the Aylsham Assembly as exciting, I fear the city of Naples overwhelmed him somewhat, but Lady Hamilton put him at his ease." Pearce could not resist the question. "And how old is your stepson, sir?" 14 years, Nelson replied. A reply which had John Pearce cursing himself for the fact that his mind was working in the same manner as that for which he had earlier castigated Henry Digby. "Might I ask you, sir, your views on flogging?" Nelson blinked, but that soon changed to a pensive look. "I subscribe to the saying, Mr. Pearce, that it makes a good man bad, and a bad man even worse. But I cannot see how we can run a ship without the use of it. Personally, I seek to avoid the use of the cat, but I have had many occasions when it was so warranted as to leave me no option. Why do you ask?" "We have one to perform on board HMS Farron, and it is to be given to a man I personally esteem." That earned him a pat on the back, one of some sympathy, as Nelson replied, holding up the letters, "With the rank goes the duty." When Pearce nodded at that, his sadness plain, Nelson added, "I would be obliged if you would visit me to take back with you my replies. I believe you are to return to Naples." "I am, sir." "Then I envy you." As John Pearce turned to leave, his action must have triggered a recollection in Nelson's mind, for he gave a little cry. "I have it! I see you now, not in the uniform you are wearing, but in seaman's ducks. In the English Channel, was it not?" There was little choice but to acknowledge the truth. "I told you, sir, I never forget a face." "Then, sir, you may well be interested to know how I came to be there." Chapter 18. The ritual of a flogging was a time-honoured affair, yet the level of brutality attendant upon that was a matter of how the captain ran his ship. It could be rendered bloody and harsh, the way favoured by the likes of Ralph Barclay, or it could be made to be an act indulged more in sorrow than in anger. Looking at Digby prior to Michael O'Hagan being brought up on deck, Pearce could see him as a man less assured than he had been the previous evening. Then, bolstered with wine and his seat at the Commodore's table, he had been full of confidence, with nary a thought to this, the other part of his responsibilities. Now that the time had come to actually proceed with the punishment, he had a distinct pallor around the gills, one which hinted to Pearce that his superior was a novice when it came to something of this nature. In their month-long voyage to La Rochelle and back, the cat had never appeared, and though he knew Digby had witnessed his own flogging on board HMS Brilliant, it was not ordered or overseen by him. Given that thought, and in revenge for having to explain his supposed heroics, Pearce could not help a little dig. "I am unsure of the procedures, sir. I hope you will advise me if I seem to be going astray." "What?" Caught off guard, trapped in his own thoughts, Digby replied with a satisfying degree of fluster, and it took him a few seconds to digest what Pearce had said. Then he produced words that made his premier feel like a scrub for baiting him. "I will not make a pretence of enjoying this, Mr. Pearce, but I fear it must be done. Fail to act, and the effect on the crew could be ruinous. So it is, as the old sage Voltaire said in his book Candide, pour encourager les autres." Digby actually blanched at that. Voltaire had used that expression 35 years previously to describe the judicial murder, the execution by firing squad on his own quarterdeck, of Admiral Byng. The act, as well as the words, had resonated throughout the service, and was reckoned to have had a telling effect on the conduct of naval officers ever since. No one wanted such a disgrace, or anything like that, as a fate. Better to die in action, however ill-judged, than face such an end. "Whatever it is, Mr. Pearce, it is deserved. My standing orders for the ship were quite specific." "Yes, sir," Pearce replied, for Digby spoke the unvarnished truth. Every officer taking command of a ship added to the Articles of War, which governed the behaviour of sailors, his own personal conditions for the way the ship should be run, and no women had been one of them, read out to the crew on the day Henry Digby took up his duties. It had been promulgated, Pearce suspected, to keep off his new ship the whores of Toulon, numerous in a naval port, and growing more so by the day in a besieged town awash with desperate refugees. But it had also been applied at Gibraltar, though mitigated for the frantic by the allowance of some shore leave. From Gibraltar there was nowhere to run. Spain would send a man back if they did not kill him, and no one was fool enough to desert to the only other landmass, the North African shore. "I would not want you to think, Mr. Pearce, that my orders were occasioned by excessive prudery." Digby was clearly referring to their earlier conversations on the subject of Lady Hamilton, seeking to point out that whatever his personal inclinations, he was in no way trying to play the preacher of abstinence. But the words had reminded Pearce of a duty he was required to perform. "On completion of this unpleasant affair, sir, can I have your permission to go aboard Agamemnon?" "For?" "Captain Nelson wishes me to take back to Naples his replies to the letters from Sir William and Lady Hamilton." "I should do that after you've seen to some fresh provisions for the ship, Mr. Pearce." "Is that not a duty you would require to undertake yourself, sir?" It was a fair question. Lacking a purser on board, the captain was responsible for the victualling of the ship, as well as the mass of bookkeeping that entailed. Given the care required to balance those books, it was risky to allow anyone else to take part in either purchase or distribution. When Digby responded, it was with a definite puff of the chest and, for him, a sound enough reason. "I would do it if I was not otherwise engaged. Commodore Lindsay wishes me to accompany him to meet with the Bey of Tunis, so as I can convey, with some force, Lord Hood's latest thoughts." Pearce thought that was gilding it. Digby had no idea of Hood's thoughts, earliest or latest. If anyone did, it was he. But that would not be a tactful thing to say to a man stuffed with pride at his invitation to take part in the mission. "You may wish to know, Mr. Pearce," Digby added, chest puffing out a bit more, "since you wish to go aboard HMS Agamemnon, that the Commodore has decided not to include Captain Nelson in his embassy. He feels no doubt that he might lack the necessary diplomacy. Now let us be about this business, for I am not blessed with much in the way of time." The ship did run to a drummer, a slip of a boy in a red coat, who reminded Pearce very much of his first sight of Martin Dent, sent into the Pelican by Barclay to spy out the land. The rattle of the lad's sticks on the skin brought the whole crew up on deck, Neame and Harbin included. A couple of the boatswain's mates rigged the grating to the poop rail. This after another had laid out a piece of canvas to keep pristine the deck planking. Michael, his hands chained together, was fetched from below by the boatswain, blinking as he came out of the tween-deck's darkness into the morning sunlight. When his eyes adjusted, he had the good grace not to look at Pearce, but to concentrate his attention on Henry Digby, who proceeded to tell him against which statutes he had transgressed. Having done that, he turned to his premier. "Mr. Pearce, this man is rated as your servant, and since there is no doubt of his guilt in the matter, it falls to you to list any circumstances which you feel may mitigate the sentence I must apply." It was just another part of the ritual. Pearce, though he could not beg for any leniency for the actual offence, insisted that Michael was a good hand, attentive to his duty, a man who would always be at the forefront of any undertaking, regardless of how unpleasant, and certainly in the article of fighting, calling on Digby to recall that he must have seen evidence of this himself. While he was talking, Charlie Taverner, who had got to the front of the assembled crew, turned round to look into the numerous sets of eyes, trying to discern who it was who had left Michael exposed. He found what he thought would be his culprits, not in their steady stare, but in the way many would not return his look. The crew of the ship had been made up of drafts from several vessels for that trip to Biscay and back, but the time that voyage took and the hazards faced should have moulded them into a bunch at ease with each other, That it had not done so entirely was obvious by what was now taking place. "Well, O'Hagan, you have heard the charge against you and the fulsome praise of Mr. Pearce. Do you have anything to say in your own defence?" Michael just shook his large square head while keeping his jaw stiff. "Then I have no option but to pay you out with a dozen of the cat. Boatswain, seize him up." The boatswain was no fool. The captain might use such an expression, but he was not about to make an enemy of a bruiser like Michael for no purpose. The Irishman was not so much seized up as led to the grating, his hands unlocked and his shirt removed without the least hint of aggression. Recalling his own experience, John Pearce wondered if Michael was to be likewise treated, and he looked hard at the cat as it was removed from the red baize bag to see of what it was made. The main rope looked solid enough, and there was no hint of softness in the tails. The truth that it was a proper instrument of punishment came when the boatswain, spreading his feet to get the right balance, struck the first blow, the sound of it thwacking against the bare flesh making him start, and Digby too. A great red wheal appeared immediately, and that was added to by another with the second blow. Though it was clear by the way the man administering the lash adjusted his footing, he was taking care not to strike on flesh already damaged. No sound came from Michael, nothing more than a stiffening of those wide shoulders. Unable to see his face, Pearce had no idea if that was registering pain, or how hard his friend was biting on the leather strap in his mouth. But he did see, when he turned, by the looks on their faces, there was anger in the crew, though they were careful not to direct it in a place where an officer could follow their gaze. That told him the culprits who had left him to be discovered would suffer, and not at the hands of Michael O'Hagan. It was after the sixth blow that Digby suddenly stepped forward, his hand held out. "Billy, that will be enough." The boatswain, in the act of preparing to swing, looked at his captain, perplexed, perhaps noticing how pale was the man's face. "I am minded to show mercy," Digby added, which brought a murmur of assent from the crew, "and freely admit that, given the offence, my original sentence was too harsh. Take him down and see to his back." As soon as Michael was untied, he pushed away those set to support him, turned to face the crew, and gave them his widest smile, only nodding as Digby added, "I hope this will learn you your lesson, fellow. I do not wish to see you at the grating again." "Thank you, sir," Pearce said softly. Digby's reply was near a whisper. "I did it for my own sake, Mr. Pearce, not for yours." There was a near shake of the body as he pulled himself together, and his tone became loud and brisk. "You will find a list of things we might purchase, along with the means to do so, on my table. Now be so good as to call up my boat. You may drop me at the flag and then make your way ashore." "Aye, aye, sir." John Pearce had found himself many times in thick crowds, but never one as dense as now, and even with a couple of trusty hands to ensure he was not robbed, he felt insecure, and kept a firm hand on his purse as well as the hilt of his sword. The quayside had been thick with humanity, but the markets were worse by far, and added to that were the cries of the vendors and the protests of their customers at the prices being quoted. Even now, when it would be cold and wet at home, it was hot here, and he had a momentary wish that he could exchange his uniform for the loose garments favoured by the locals. His one advantage lay in his height. He could see over the heads of the crowd and pick those stalls he wished to call on. His major disadvantage was in the lack of the language, though he suspected the locals knew more than they let on, which became a handicap all the greater when it came to arguing about price. The whole area, a series of narrow alleys in between buildings that seemed to be constructed of mud, was lined with cave-like emporiums and street stalls covered with awnings to keep out the sun. They had a series of ever-changing smells, the like of which he had never experienced. The high odour of too ripe fruit, some of which on seeing them he could not name, the heady smell of spices, the aroma of meat and fish being cooked on charcoal burners, the sharp tang of lemons, the whiff of the hookah pipes and the scented tobacco they contained, the whole overlaid with the reek of mangy dogs, ordure, human sweat, and the high-pitched cries of the vendors. Bargaining was lengthy and complex, made more so by the endless misunderstandings, which made him wish he had availed himself of whoever it was who represented British vessels calling at Tunis. He had no desire to convey what he purchased to the boat himself, and that involved alterations to what he had agreed, which included endless arm-waving and shouting. But after 2 hours of haggling, exhausted by the effort, he was back on the quayside, ready to call in the cutter when his goods arrived, and he had found a space where he could rest his weary legs on a stone bollard. Along the quay there were dozens of vessels loading and unloading, Tunis being a great trading port, and looking at the fellows doing the carting of the cargoes, he had little doubt, given their emaciated appearance and air of misery, that they were slaves. After a while, with a certain degree of guilt, he stood up and insisted that his 2 escorting hands, in turns, take the weight off their feet, an offer which was greeted with ill-disguised surprise. That led Pearce to think of his pelicans, who, away from authority, would not have been shy to tell him they needed a rest as much as he. But he had left Charlie and Rufus behind, Michael not being an option, so as to allay some of the feelings of the crew regarding favouritism. He began to pace up and down in an increasing number of steps, looking at the great gate in the city wall, with the teeth of a portcullis showing at the top, wondering how long it would take for his purchases to arrive. That brought him close to a moving line of dust-coated creatures, bent when they were carrying sacks towards and up a gangplank, stumbling when they returned for their next load. An overseer with a whip stood to one side, his rasping voice calling for effort, his hand twitching to tell his charges that he had a whip and he would use it. Pearce stopped to watch, wondering what the anti-slavery campaigners of the British Isles would make of such a sight. Vexed by the Atlantic trade, this would displease them just as much, for here was every race represented, including Nubians. Was it not on a journey to Egypt that William Wilberforce was first converted to the cause of the Testonites? Was it such a sight as John Pearce was witnessing now that persuaded him of the evils of human bondage? He only became aware that one of the overworked creatures had stopped and was staring at him because the weary workers following and not looking bumped into him, that bringing a shout from the overseer. Pearce found himself looking into a heavily bearded face, bronzed where the sun had not actually burnt off the skin, and a pair of bird-like brown eyes that seemed familiar. It was in the act of trying to place the memory they triggered that the fellow spoke his name.
Pearce!
That made him look harder, and the voice hissed again.
It's Ben!
The overseer was on his way, bustling through the line, furious of face, hand held out to the side with his whip ready to use. It was instinct rather than knowledge that made Pearce interpose himself between the man and the intended victim, as he tried to make sense of the words he had just heard. So it was with a feeling of deep confusion he replied,
Ben? Walker, you recall me, John Pearce?
The hand of the overseer on his shoulder stopped his intended reply, the man seeking to spin him out of the way, an act which caused Pearce to do 2 things: resist and call forward his 2 escorting sailors. Turning to face the overseer, who now had his whip hand raised, his mind reeling with a dozen inchoate thoughts, Pearce pushed him hard, then had to do so again and with more force when the man did not yield. The overseer stepped back and raised his whip with the clear intention of using it, so Pearce whipped out his sword, which gave the fellow pause enough for his 2 tars to get alongside him. With the fully extended tip pointing at his throat, the overseer stepped well back, emitting a series of loud shouts, to whom Pearce had no idea.
"Keep this bastard away from me,"
he growled, handing the blade to one of his men. Then he turned back to the bent-over creature who had addressed him, seeing a body now racked with sobs. Could this really be Ben Walker, another one-time pelican, a man who had been pressed by Ralph Barclay on the same night as he?
"I was told you were dead, Ben."
What came out in reply lacked coherence, being more a set of disjointed statements.
"Went overboard. Floated on a hatch cover. Was picked up at the galley we was fighting. God is paying me back for my sins."
There was no time to wonder what sins Ben referred to, even if it had always intrigued Pearce, he being the only one of the men he had messed with aboard Barclay's frigate who would not tell a soul why he had taken refuge in the Liberties. Raising his eyes, he saw that the overseer's shouting had brought most of the people on the quayside to a standstill, and all were staring in his direction. The words that followed were instinctive, and took no cognizance of the how. "We must get you out of this, Ben."
"Our men coming, your honour," said one of his sailors, "and they don't look in a mood to parley."
"Keep an eye on this man," Pearce barked. Taking back his sword, he turned towards the walls of the city and the arched gate from which a party of musket-bearing soldiers had just emerged, jogging along, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. Quickly he sheathed the weapon, reckoning it to be useless against muskets, and examined those approaching, not impressed by their slovenly excuses for a uniform. Less than clean garments, and turbans which had at one time all been the same colour, but were in various stages of fading now. The man leading them had a fine set of moustaches on a near black-skinned face, and an expression, aided by his Levantine nose, which boded ill.
"Lieutenant Pearce of His Britannic Majesty's Navy!"
he yelled, in a voice so loud it rebounded off the city walls. The level of his shout, and the confident way he both emitted it and stood foursquare to greet these fellows, made the moustached leader slow his pace, and Pearce was encouraged by the look of confusion in the man's eyes. The overseer was shouting in his own tongue, the whip waving in anger, that before he recalled his true duty, and began to belabour his other charges to get back to their tasks. By the time he had achieved that, Pearce found himself face to face with that set of moustaches and penetrating black eyes, while the two men with him had got Ben Walker between them, then covered his back from the rest of the armed party, which now had them surrounded. Pearce, keeping his hand on his sword, tried a bit of French on the chief, to no avail, and the man had no English either. What he did have was a high-pitched voice, a definite grievance, eyes that flashed with ire, and an incomprehensible tongue. Gently, Pearce brought Ben alongside him and tried, with gestures and single words, to explain.
"British. Sailors. No slave."
He pointed to where HMS Alcide lay, then up at the flag, which had on it the device of his country, his finger jabbing between it and the hunched figure he was simultaneously trying to console. The musket twitched. Another stream of unknown words followed, accompanied by furious shaking of the head, and all the while the overseer added his own complaints to the exchange, which left Pearce at a stand. Given a file of marines and their muskets, he would have taken this lot on and marched Ben down to the ship's boat. But he lacked that, and worse, he was surrounded and outnumbered, and quite sure he had no rights in the matter that would make any sense to those with whom he was arguing. As well as that, he could see the leader of the armed party was growing less patient and more hysterical in his pronouncements as time went by, less willing to even stop talking and try to make sense of John Pearce's gestures. He had 2 men and 1 sword to set against them, and that would not do, although he did wonder if these locals would use their weapons, with several British warships so close by. The trouble was they were not close enough by. They were well out of earshot, and it was with great reluctance that he bent down and whispered to Ben. "I must give you back to them now, Ben, for I cannot make them understand, but I will get you out of this. When the Commodore hears they are holding a British tar, he will threaten to blow the place apart lest they release you."
"They won't give me up, Pearce," Ben replied huskily. "It's not their way."
"I'll make it their way." Ben's bird-like eyes fixed on his face, looking for reassurance. There was so much Pearce wanted to say, and no time to say it, and with a feeling of failure he gently pushed Ben forward until he stumbled out of his reach. Seeing the overseer twitch his whip, Pearce yelled loud enough to make the moustaches jump back and lower his musket, but he raised it again when he realized the shot was aimed at the overseer. The other threat to that same target the half of the sword which had scraped out of its scabbard. "A day, Ben! No more, and you'll be free!" A couple of sharp commands had the armed party moving away from them, but they did not disappear, staying to watch Pearce as he took possession of and oversaw the loading of his stores into the ship's cutter, stony of face every time he turned to look in the direction of Ben Walker, back in the line of sack-bearing slaves. Bent, he stopped moving only once, and that was when Pearce ordered the cutter to haul off. Ben began to wave, but that stopped abruptly as the overseer's whip took him across the back. Chapter 19. "He is a British sailor, sir, albeit a wrongly pressed one. I told you what happened in the liberties of the Savoy, and he is doubly a victim of Captain Barclay's iniquity." Nelson replied with a shake of the head, his tone nasal, which led to the appearance of a handkerchief and a stiff blow of the nose. "I doubt he is the only one of our countrymen condemned to slavery in this hellhole, and that takes no account of the women who have also been taken by these damned pirates and sold into the evils of the harem. It is one of the points Commodore Lindsay raised with the Bey on our first meeting, but the old rogue made it plain that the only way to secure the release of such unfortunates was to buy them, that is, if anyone could be found and identified." "Then we must do that. My man I have identified." "Lindsay rejected the notion out of hand, and rightly so, to my mind. Pay up, and we would only encourage the Mussulmen to take more hostages in the future. Besides, no kind of price was mentioned, so every transaction would be an individual one, and that for people who have been sold into slavery. We would be here for weeks, and unsure at the conclusion if we had got everyone out who deserved release." "There is another way, sir." Nelson smiled at that, for the other option was a very obvious one. "I see you are a man after my own heart, Mr. Pearce. I cannot abide negotiation where it will achieve nothing. Hot air to no end. You know from the Commodore's dinner my views of what we should do regarding the French, and nothing would give more pleasure than to put a few round-shot into the souk as well. But I am seen as overzealous in the suggestion of such methods." "Then I must request assistance from the Commodore." The smile vanished, and though Nelson said nothing, it was obvious he thought Pearce would get little help from that quarter. He picked up an oilskin package from his desk. "It seems insensitive to mention it, Mr. Pearce, given what you have just experienced, but these are the letters I mentioned." "I will take them, sir. Regardless of what else happens, I am obliged to return and see Sir William." The voice was almost silky as Nelson added, "And his wife, Mr. Pearce, and his wife." Pearce had his mind on Ben Walker, and thus he was dismissive of what he was hearing. "I dare say I shall, sir, but that will be secondary." It was clear by the sudden way he frowned that Nelson took exception to the last word in that sentence. "Do not underestimate the lady, Mr. Pearce. Do not be sidetracked by the claptrap regarding her reputation." "I am not, sir," Pearce insisted, well aware that was not the literal truth, a thought which stopped him from adding the plain fact that she did have one, and no amount of good opinions would remove it. "I am glad to hear you say it. Lady Hamilton is much traduced, and would you believe it, sir, by people to whom she has shown nothing but kindness. I spent only 3 days in their company, but never have I met such sagacity and benevolence in a married couple. They think alike and act in unison, a trait so rare as to be remarkable." "There is no doubt, sir, that Lady Hamilton is remarkable." Nelson completely missed the irony in that statement, and carried on as if Pearce had not spoken. "Sir William is plagued by visitors from England, some in straitened circumstances, seeking funds, others on the grand tour, all of whom demand not only his attention, but tread mightily on his kindness and hospitality." Pearce did not want to be here listening to this. He wanted to be away and trying to get Ben Walker free, and it struck him as selfish that Nelson was taking no notice of the urgency of the situation. Then he realized, and he cursed himself for not doing so sooner, that Lindsay and Digby, if they had not returned to HMS Alcide, must still be with the Bey. So that was where he should be. the only place where, violence excluded, anything could be achieved. Nelson was still waxing lyrical about the Hamiltons and their sagacity when he cut across him, reaching out to take the packet of letters. "I will see these delivered, sir, but now I must take my leave." Too startled to reply, Nelson just nodded. Once out the door, Pearce ran to the entry port and called in his boat, yelling at them once he had leapt in, to row like the devil for the quay. The stores he had garnered, which required to be taken on board ship, fruit, fresh unleavened bread, chickens, and a kid, would have to wait. He knew he was too late when, on jumping ashore, he saw their party emerge from the city gate, full of the pomp of their embassy, their escort a quartet of marines. Seeing him approach, and the hurried manner in which he did so, they stopped. Lindsay's doleful face suddenly creased with worry, as if Pearce was a harbinger of some very bad news. When he gabbled out what it was which had made him so excited, it failed to raise in any other breast the level of concern which he expected.
"Mr. Pearce," Lindsay barked, "you cannot be seriously accosting me here on the quay to request that I ignore the purpose of my mission?"
That answer perplexed Pearce. "I don't see the connection, sir."
"Then, Lieutenant," Lindsay snapped, "you are somewhat lacking in sense. In fact, I would go so far as to say you are acting like a fool."
John Pearce had never enjoyed being talked to in that manner, and he did not like it now. Digby obviously saw the way his face closed up in anger, and just as obviously saw, in the tightly clenched fists, the possibility that his Premier might actually strike the Commodore. Hastily he stepped forward.
"How dare you, Mr. Pearce, accost us with such a problem after the morning we have had?"
That gave the man addressed enough pause to realize, even if he had been insulted, no good would come of any aggressive response.
"We have just spent 2 hours in the company of the Bey of Tunis, and I doubt the Commodore will mind it if I say it has to be about the most frustrating period a man could endure."
Pearce spoke past Digby to Lindsay.
"And I, sir, have found a member of the King's Navy working as a slave, and coerced with the use of a whip for the slightest infraction. I doubt your frustrations equal his when he sees the armed vessels of his fellow countrymen anchored offshore." "I will not stand here in a public place and dispute this with you, Lieutenant," Lindsay growled, "and you forget yourself when you address so someone of my rank."
"I think you will find, sir, that I have used the same tone with your brother-in-law on more than one occasion, and I have pointed out to him, as I will to you, that rank does not obviate responsibility."
"Captain Digby, get this man out of my sight!"
"Sir," Digby replied, taking Pearce's arm and dragging him to one side so the Commodore and his escorting marines could proceed. The orders for Digby were delivered over Lindsay's shoulders as he made for his barge.
"You have your boat tied up by my own, Mr. Digby. I suggest you repair aboard your ship, and once I have sent over my letters to Lord Hood, you will proceed to sea with all dispatch."
"Sir," Digby replied, looking distinctly crestfallen. Then he rounded on Pearce.
"Now see what you have done."
"What?"
"You have got me tarred with the same brush he wishes to use on you. Do you think of nothing but your own personal standing?"
Digby was shocked by the abruptness of that, and Pearce was not about to let him off at all.
"There is a fellow over there who is connected to me in the most compelling way. A man who never wanted to be a sailor, but thanks to the rottenness of this damned service, is now a slave. If he is not rescued, he will die as one. And you wish me to give a fig for the frustrations of a Commodore, or how you stand in his estimation? You can no more address me so than... If you will not aid me in getting him free, then I will do so myself." "You will not, Mr. Pearce." "I cannot see what will stop me." "I will at pistol point if need be."
Pearce made to speak, but Digby was angry enough to overbear that.
"What do you think we have been through this morning? That old Cretan pirate has made it quite plain that the slightest provocation will lead to this port being closed to British shipping. Probably a good thing. It is not."
To stand here arguing with Digby would achieve nothing, but it was with no idea how he was going to alter the situation that Pearce decided to relent, though the men continued to stare at each other for several seconds. In that time, one mind was racing. Pearce needed to get aboard and enlist help. Was Michael fit enough, after half a dozen lashes, to aid him? Would Charlie and Rufus agree that Ben Walker, better known to them than Pearce, must be rescued. What of Latimer and Blubber? And were there any other members of the crew who would help? How could he get a boat and the arms necessary to do what must be done?
"You cannot jeopardize the whole British position in the Mediterranean to save one man, Mr. Pearce, much as it may seem the right thing to do."
Digby had modified his tone, and while it was not emollient, neither was it harsh. And his look had changed as well, as if trying to convey that he understood the concern, but was in a position to see both sides of the argument. As he continued, his voice softened to one of concern.
"Men are lost to the Navy all the time, through sickness, accident, and enemy action, and we mourn for them all. You must, I'm afraid, think of the fellow you have seen in the same way, for he is beyond any help we can provide for him."
"Yes," Pearce replied, his shoulders slumping.
"Come, let us repair aboard. We have our orders to get to sea. The tasks attendant upon that will occupy your mind, so that you do not brood on your failure."
Pearce nodded and headed for the ship's boat, while cautiously, so as not to be observed, casting his eyes along the edge of the quay in an effort to see if Ben Walker was still there, still toiling. There was no sign of him that he could make out, but that was not surprising, given the density of the crowds. If he was employed in shiploading, he was likely to be worked at that most days. Looking down into the cutter, Digby must have seen it still contained the articles and animals Pearce had purchased, but he said nothing about them lying there in the sun, merely climbing down to join Pearce in the thwarts. With the boat cast off, Pearce could look at the shore without subterfuge, his mind working on the problem of rescue, while only half listening to Digby as he outlined the nub of the meeting they had had with the Bay, and the frustrations of dealing with such a scoundrel.
"He blocked us at every turn. Not only did he refuse to bar the French from the North African ports he controls, the old sod would not even acknowledge that pirates operate from the smaller harbours of his domain with impunity. You should see him, Mr. Pearce. He was like some character from a Rari show. Dark skin, black eyes, and cruel lips over gold teeth that made me think I would not wish to fall into his hands. When Lindsay termed him a rogue, he did not lie. He even washed his hands as we departed, as though exposure to a Christian tainted his skin in some way. The Commodore was cursing most of the way back, damning the sod and hoping that one day he could return with a fleet and put paid to his pretensions."
Pearce was wondering how he could delay the departure of HMS Pharaon long enough to sound out his pelicans. He needed swords and his own pistols, not muskets, they would be too unwieldy, a boat to get them back ashore, though he reckoned he would have to lay off till late in the day. It mattered not if his own ship had sailed, it would suffice to get Ben onto a British deck, Nelson's Agamemnon for preference. There would be hell to pay, and no pitch hot, but that would just have to be faced when the time came to meet it. Vaguely he heard the cry that told him they were coming alongside, and he shook himself to concentrate as the oars were shipped and the boat bumped gently into the scantlings. He followed Digby up and onto the deck, to overhear the captain giving Harbin instructions to get the stores aboard, and to Neame, the master, orders to prepare to weigh, which underlined how little time he had. Digby made for his cabin, and Pearce went to change, ostensibly into working garments, but really to divest himself of any uniform at all. Coat off, Pearce went to seek his friends. Michael was in what passed for a sick bay, a piece of canvas stuck across an alcove just big enough for a cot, and was glad to see the Irishman sit up, albeit stiffly, as he pulled it back, while above their heads the deck resonated with the thud of moving feet, and the sound of the various whistled commands came through the planking.
"Ben Walker!"
Michael cried, causing Pearce to pull shut the canvas and request to keep his voice down.
"The Blessed Mary has saved him. Martin Dent told me he was dead drowned for certain." "The Blessed Mary has dropped him into hell, brother, and we must do something to save him."
Quickly leaving out what had happened when he confronted the Bay's militia, Pearce explained how he had spotted Ben and spoken with him.
"How in the name of Jesus?"
"Never mind that, Michael.
Are you fit enough to aid me?"
O'Hagan began to get himself upright.
"Just don't slap my back, John boy, or for sure you'll feel my fist." We're awaiting the Commodore's dispatch, and once we have that, Digby will weigh. I must speak with Charlie and Rufus, who will be about some duty or other. Cast around, see if you can get us some weapons while I fetch my pistols. Is it a fight we'll be having?" Thinking on the crowded quay, that overseer with his whip and the proximity of those armed men, Pearce replied, "Not if I can help it, Michael. I want to get ashore, grab Ben, and get away as fast as we can, possibly just as it's getting dark." Pearce pulled back the screen to find Digby standing there, accompanied by a couple of the larger members of the crew. "Mr. Pearce, I fear I must ask you to confine yourself to your cabin till we sail." Please, Mr. Pearce, I'm not a fool. You may think your air of distraction and acceptance fooled me, but it did not. And given I know something of both your nature and the level of hot-headedness to which you are prone, I think it is in the best interests of both you and the men you are close to that you should be kept away from any foolishness." Digby looked past Pearce to Michael O'Hagan. "And you should get back into that cot, for if you disobey me this time, it will not be the cat you will face, but the rope." Feeling the pressure against his back, Pearce snapped, "Belay, Michael. Do as the captain says." "Do not think, Mr. Pearce, that I lack sympathy for the plight in which you find yourself. Far from it. And leaving your fellow to his fate does not make me feel comfortable. But the good of the service takes precedence over all, and there is no doubt in this case where that lies." Pearce was wondering if a thump to floor Digby would help him get free, but the captain had outlined what would happen then. The 2 sailors Digby had fetched with him would obey the orders they must have been given to restrain him if necessary, and there was no knowing what Michael would do if a fight started. Nor could he see any way, even if he could overcome them, of getting off the ship with what he needed in weapons and company without having to take on half the crew.
End of CD 8.
The crack of musketry, which had faded as the Allied troops moved forward, was not diminishing now. It was getting increasingly noisy. Peering through the darkness, Ralph Barclay watched the flashes from the muzzles, and it was telling that he could see too many and too much. Those of his fellow countrymen and allies should be pan-flashes and faint from being aimed away from where he stood. But the numerous flickers he now saw were from muzzles pointing in his direction. The French appeared to be counter-attacking. Land battle was not Ralph Barclay's natural forte, but he was well enough informed to know that the overriding attribute was a kind of fog which settled over the contested locale, and confined each area of action to that which was immediately visible. It was like fighting on the lower decks of a ship, which only allowed you to see that right in front of your nose. He could be wrong about a counterattack, and even if he was not, it might be contained. The task Burns had been set was to disable the French guns. Outside that, there was nothing for him to do. Could Ralph Barclay justify to himself doing something else? "Devereux, get back on those levers and turn those guns round. I want them facing the backs of our troops." "Aye, aye, sir." By some method unknown to his superior, Devereux had exerted control of Toby Burns's men. He probably threatened to belt a couple. That mattered not. What was important was that he was obeyed as he called for help. Levers were stuck under the still intact trunnions, and the cannon was slowly but surely turned, a bit at a time, until they were facing out of the rear of the position. By the time they had achieved that, there could be no doubt about what was happening. The Allied troops were falling back. "Find anything you can, Devereux, balls included, and jam it down the muzzles." "And still treble charges, Your Honour." "We may need to slow up the enemy, but at the same time we must somehow destroy these cannon. Get some men to rig extra long lanyards on the flints. If need be, I want to be able to fire them off when we're behind cover." The first retreating troops were Spaniards, very obvious in their green uniforms and white bandolier straps, and they hesitated at the sight of Ralph Barclay yelling and waving his sword. But he could not stop them. Knowing they could not get past him, they went round the redoubt in a wide circle, running all the while until their forms disappeared into the darkness. More followed, and as they did so the level of musketry aimed at their backs grew steadily, the powder flashes assuming a near-regular pattern, which underlined that whoever was leading the counterattack was doing so in a disciplined manner, and all the while ghostly shapes were slipping by their position, making for their own lines and safety. General O'Hara did not slip by. He staggered, gasping for breath, into the rear of the position, needing Ralph Barclay to step forward and support him. Only when he grabbed his arm and the general yelled in pain did he realize the man was wounded, that the arm he had tried to take was not uniform scarlet, but of a much darker, blood-red hue. "Devereux, help me!" "Lost the initiative," O'Hara wheezed, his breath being inhaled in great gulps. "Won't hold this position, Captain. Spike the guns and get out of here." "Get him to the other side of that breastwork, Devereux, and make sure he is comfortable." The sailor lifted O'Hara with no difficulty, though not without causing him to gasp in pain, and then he eased himself at his charge over the rampart. There he laid the general down, his head against a sandbag. "Now you just sit there and take it easy, Your Honour, and we'll be right back." "Spike those guns!" Devereux just tapped his good shoulder and went back to where Ralph Barclay stood, staring into the night, trying to work out the range between the cannon and those rapidly approaching muzzle and pan flashes. There were still a few pointing away from him, but they were useless against the dozens aimed in his direction, and in no time the balls they discharged were whistling, thudding into the sandbags by which he stood. "Time to fetch them a surprise, Devereux." "Ready when you are, Your Honour." "Get the men with the lanyards behind cover and join them." "Best I wait for you, sir." There was no rancour in Barclay's voice as he said, "Do as I tell you, for I will join you presently." "Aye, aye, Captain." Looking around the cannon before him, ignoring what shot was coming his way, he reckoned all was ready, and he took in his hand one of the torches that had illuminated the ground in front of the position. The men he had put to the powder had laid a trail for him to ignite, and he was pondering how to get the powder barrels to blow when the French were close enough to suffer by it, when the musket ball took him, shattering his left elbow. Ralph Barclay spun away, feeling no pain, but a deep degree of shock, the torch dropping from his other hand as he hunched over. But his mind was still alive to his duty, and he screamed for Devereux, grateful that Brilliant's bully boy was with him in a second. "Light the powder, Devereux," Barclay hissed through clenched teeth. "Then get us over that damned earthwork and fire the cannon. You give the order." Devereux never let go of his captain as he complied, watching for only a second as the powder took the flame and the line of sparking fire fizzed away towards the stacked powder casks. Helping Ralph Barclay over the rampart was not easy. He declined to be lifted, but as soon as their heads were below the parapet, the sailor gave the command to pull on the extended lanyards. They could not see, but the flints produced proper sparks. So deafening was the sound it seemed that powder and cannon went off together. Two of the men from Britannia nearly perished as one of the recoiling guns, bereft of restraining tackles and blown back by the blast, rammed itself, trunnions and all, back into the breastwork and demolished it, they managing to jump clear just in the nick of time. The air was full of sound and fury, bits of metal and wood, sand and earth, though there was no sight of any bodies. The only human shapes to be seen once the dust had settled were the sailors who made up his party, running as fast as their legs would carry them back towards Toulon. Ralph Barclay yelled, but it was too feeble to stop their flight. "The General, Devereux! Look to General O'Hara!" Glancing back to where O'Hara lay, his eyes closed and his arm limp, and then looking at his captain bent over an elbow that was now obviously giving him excruciating pain, Devereux knew where, for him, his duty lay. "General's not here, Your Honour," he whispered. "Must have made off." Ralph Barclay nodded without looking up, and Devereux helped him to his feet, getting him upright just as he passed out. Dropping his shoulder, he let his captain fall onto it. Then, standing up, he began to trot after the other sailors, Ralph Barclay over his shoulder. Chapter 21.
Ralph Barclay was still unconscious when Devereux carried him into the hospital, stepping as he did so over the numerous casualties laying in the corridor from the earlier part of the assault. Men moaning with wounds trivial or so serious they would not survive the night. The light of the dozens of oil lamps helping to create a scene from hell. He found Emily Barclay, her mob cap and apron heavily stained with blood, her face covered in a slight sheen of sweat, bandaging the chest of a man who looked to have had a musket ball removed. She did not become aware of him standing there for some time, so fixated was she on what she was about. But eventually she did look up to see the dangling legs in what had been white stocking breeches over the shoulder of a fellow whose face was hidden by the upper part of the body. "There is no priority for officers. Go back to the corridor and wait your turn." The turn Devereux took was just enough to show his face, so blackened by the night's exertions that for a moment Emily did not recognize him, though that was short-lived, as the grating voice provided the clue.
"A special case, Mrs. Barclay, I would say."
She was about to protest there was no such thing when he added,
"I don't know none more deserving of that than your own wedded husband."
The work on the wounded lasted all night, and still they were coming in, this time those who needed to be stretchered, so it was near to midday before Emily could pay a visit to the bed in which her husband lay, which had been Lutchens's place of rest, and then her own. He was asleep, or in a state of deep unconsciousness, it mattered not. His eyes were closed and his face peaceful. Lutchens had operated as quickly as he could, but the arm could not be saved, and the stump, with the ligature in place to alert for corruption hanging from the end, lay in its bandages above the coverlet under which he rested. Gently she touched his face, so peaceful in repose, so unlike the last furious glare it had held in her presence, and tears pricked her eyes as she saw him as he had been at their wedding, full of joy, even surprise when she consented with the words, "I do." That was gone now, never to return, but he was and would be for some time an invalid. He would have to be cared for, and it fell to her to be his nurse, a duty she could not pass to another. If society would not forgive her readily for her separation from him, it would treat her with contempt if she deserted him now.
"Is he going to be all right, Mum?"
Devereux's bulk filled the doorway, and for all his well-deserved reputation for being an oppressor of his fellow man, his face looked very different now, concerned as a parent might be for a sick child. "I cannot tell you, Devereux. All I can say is that we must wait and see what develops."
"Seeing you hard by will help him mend."
"Are you so sure of that?"
"Never been more certain, Mum."
Toby Burns reappeared aboard HMS Britannia with his head swabbed in a thick, blood-stained and untidy bandage, though he had managed to ram his hat on to contain it, reporting to the Premier to tell how he had fallen in the dark and hit his head so severely he passed out. Given the mood on the ship was gloomy, everyone knew the attack had not gone well, and a number of the flagship's marines were known to be dead, others badly wounded. The first lieutenant had other things on his mind. "I was so busy encouraging the men to go forward," the Premier interrupted. "I have been told that a post-captain was doing likewise." "My uncle, Sir Ralph Barclay, who was kind enough to offer me his assistance." "No doubt, Burns, he thought as I did that you were a trifle wet behind the ears for such a duty." Suddenly recollecting from where the orders to send this midshipman ashore had emanated, the lieutenant recovered himself. "Mind, I am sure you were up to it, otherwise the Admiral would not have recommended you." "He did say he would provide me with opportunities to distinguish myself." His superior was looking at him, obviously wondering why. Toby Burns knew. The supposed reward, which he would most happily have foregone, was presented to him after he had sat with Sir William Hotham and his secretary, listing what he knew of the true story of the night John Pearce had been pressed, and giving as full an account of the lies he had told on behalf of his uncle. "It is as well the guns were destroyed without spiking." "I feel very keenly in my failure there, sir." "Are you fit for duty, boy?" "I think I am, sir." "Best run along to the surgeon and get him to have a look at your wound. Let him decide."
Aye, aye, sir.
Toby Burns left the wardroom and made his way back to the midshipman's berth. There was a scrap of mirror there, and he examined his reflection to see how his bandage looked. It had been damned hard to wind it on himself, the blood more easy to come by with so many wounded staggering back to the Allied lines. It would stay on his head for as long as he could manage, and he would look to replace it with something clean. No surgeon would be permitted to look at his head to observe there was no wound, and when asked, as he was bound to be, about how it had come about, well, he would tell his messmates, in sorrow, how mortified he was to have missed his proper part in the battle. The attack had been a fiasco, starting well but descending into chaos as Dundas lost control of his troops. The retreating, indeed routed, French gunners had tempted them into pursuit. Someone, and it was suspected it would be the new general in charge, had rallied a defence, then brought forward enough men to halt the attack and then send the Allied assault tumbling back to their start lines. General O'Hara had been captured, though the French had obliged by sending a note over to say he was wounded but well, proving that even in a revolutionary rabble some standards of military courtesy remained.
O'Hara was not supposed to be anywhere near the action, sir, Hyde Parker said to a melancholy Hood. He has only himself to blame. The last word stirred Hood, who knew very well where blame would lie. The table before the commanding admiral was laden with after-action reports, none of which made pleasant reading. Casualties were high, but it was the effect on the morale of the remaining troops which featured most in his thoughts. He had sanctioned the action on the very clear instruction of the limited nature of what could be destroyed, taken and held, and that directive had been ignored. The notion had been to bloody the nose of the enemy and make them careful in their progress, to gain time. The result would be exactly the opposite.
"Best call a conference of the commanders, Parker."
He then waved his hand over the reports.
"We need to fully review our position in light of this."
To include Admiral Hotham, sir?
The eyes blazed for a second, and the grey eyebrows twitched. But that look of defiance that went with that was brief, and it was an angry admiral who hissed,
"Oh, yes, let the bugger come and gloat."
"The failure is not yours, sir," Parker insisted. "It is the fault of the soldiers."
"God forbid that one day, Parker, you find yourself in command of a combined operation, for if you do, you will discover that whoever fails, the blame will be laid squarely at your door."
Routine has a habit of asserting itself over all other concerns, and sailing north through the Tyrrhenian Sea, with the faint outline of Sicily on the starboard quarter, John Pearce's thoughts of the plight of Ben Walker eased somewhat. The man was not forgotten, but he moved from the front of his concern to that area of future speculation about what might be done in an unforeseeable future. Pearce had also begun to see how he had suffered from a rush of blood to the head, and also to appreciate what Henry Digby had saved him from. And not only him. The idea of a swift rescue had been madness, and he was uncomfortably aware that he was becoming a victim of his own hubris. Everything he had so far attempted in this naval interlude, barring getting his pelicans free, had been a success, so much so that he could not even consider the notion, and more tellingly the consequences, of failure. He was watching the crew airing the sails when Digby came on deck, the lifting of hats and the stiffening of bodies alerting him to the captain's presence, and he turned to raise his own. Digby looked at him in a deliberate way, seeking some sign, for he had been wary of too close an approach, and Pearce was happy to oblige. "Time for an olive branch." "Mr. Neame tells me we will raise Naples by nightfall, sir, but recommends standing off till dawn." "Very wise, Mr. Pearce. Even in such an open bay there are too many islands." "I was wondering, sir, if you would see it as consistent with your dignity that you accompany me to meet with Sir William Hamilton." Digby's jaw dropped to his chest, and he stood in an attitude of deep study, and Pearce knew what was going through his mind. He had not had a chance to present his compliments to the Hamiltons on the first visit. Could he consider it now, or would that make him look like a pawn to his premier? Could he add anything to the mission Pearce was on, or would he be left to stand idly by looking like a fool? Against that, there was his position as master and commander of this vessel. He was almost obliged to pay his respects, and not to do so might be seen as unbecoming arrogance, not something he would wish the British ambassador to think if his name ever came up. "I am merely waiting upon Sir William to hear the result of his conversations with Queen Caroline, sir," Pearce added, moving closer so as not to be overheard. "You will understand that such matters do not enter into my consideration, Mr. Pearce. I merely think that a failure to make myself known to Sir William, which as the ship's captain is my duty, would border on impertinence." "I so agree, sir," Pearce replied happily. Winter it might be, but it was a bright, clear day as they opened the Bay of Naples, and this time it came to them in all its glory, the wide sweep from Ischia down to Sorrento, white sands intermingled with colourful villages, the Palazzo Reale splendid in its mile-long frontage, with the dramatic backdrop of the older castle of St. Elmo, and smoking Vesuvius as the crown of the view. They had obviously been sighted from the shore, for they had hardly anchored before they could see, in the boat approaching with some haste, the figure of Sir William Hamilton, clearly intent on coming aboard. "Man ropes at the gangway," Pearce shouted, "and hands standing by to help our visitor." "Mr. Pearce," Digby said, "make sure you do not forget the salute." "And the ambassador, sir?" "We'll have to share it with royalty." The brass signal gun was booming away as Sir William clambered aboard, helped up the man-ropes with a sailor at each side and one below to prevent a fall. As he made the quarterdeck, he raised his hat to the ship's flag. "Mr. Pearce," he said in a slightly breathless way. Pearce spoke quickly, his mind firmly on his captain's dignity. "May I present to you Henry Digby, master and commander of HMS Farron?" "I am delighted to welcome you aboard, sir," said Digby, as the last boom of the salute died away. "Obliged," Hamilton said impatiently. But I have little time, Captain, for pleasantries. Mr. Pearce, I need a word with you in private. I have a message for Lord Hood, and I wish it to be delivered with all speed." "Damn," thought Pearce, as he saw Digby's face close up. Hamilton had not spoken quietly, so half the ears on the ship, busy with the aftermath of anchoring, had heard those words. "I would ask that Captain Digby join us, sir," he said hurriedly. Sir William Hamilton looked perplexed, being well aware that Pearce had come to him with a private and verbal message, hence his desire to send back his reply in a like manner. "I have made the captain privy to our discussion," Pearce said very quietly. "So be it, Mr. Pearce. That is for you to decide." Digby spoke then, and the hurt was plain in his tone. "Please, Sir William, use my cabin. I have many duties to perform in getting the ship anchored." "I should put aside any thought of that, Captain. What I have to say to Mr. Pearce will brook no delay. You must set sail for Toulon as soon as I am back in my boat." The ambassador looked hard at Digby to ensure he understood, then snapped, "Mr. Pearce, lead the way." It was a red-faced Henry Digby they left on deck, and a very unhappy John Pearce who led the older man to the privacy of the main cabin. Door closed, Sir William wasted no time. "We've had a communication from Prince Pignatelli requesting permission to evacuate his men, and asking that we send ships for the purpose. You will readily appreciate that in the face of such a message, the notion of sending more troops is not something to consider." "May I ask what has happened to bring this about?" "I do not know, but it is clear the fellow thinks the situation is bad and likely to get worse. Lord Hood must be told of his feelings, so he has a chance to ensure that Prince Pignatelli does not withdraw his men prematurely. I must urge you to bend on every sail you possess, and get this to the Admiral with haste, so he can act to counter it." "I would be obliged, Sir William, if that is a request you could put to the captain of the ship." "Very well. And while you are doing that, I will fetch for you the letters I brought back from Captain Nelson." There was a brief flash of something across the ambassador's face then, like impatience, but there was no time to wonder on that as he spun round and went out through the cabin door. The passing of letters and his return to his boat were two things quickly done, and as soon as the rowers unhooked, Digby gave the orders to man the capstan. They were back at sea within half a glass, that view they had so admired now disappearing over the stern. The news of Captain Barclay's lost arm rippled through HMS Brilliant, producing a raft of reactions. For Lieutenant Glaister, with so many officers engaged on shore duty, it allowed him to dream of a step up. He would not get a frigate, but in the shuffle attendant on providing his present ship with a new captain, given that such a wound as Barclay had sustained would take months from which to recover, all things were possible. Then he turned his mind to those purloined stores, and that was a worry. Any new commanding officer coming aboard would wonder at the way the frigate's holds were filled to near bursting with everything marked as French. He would see it as illegal, and he would know such a thing could not have happened without his connivance, while the chances of him being like-minded regarding the profits to be made were low. They had to be got rid of, for if it were exposed he would be ruined. Not much point in a quick gain from larceny if he forfeited his career. Gerson likewise had cause to consider what to do, especially when Glaister told him of his conclusion. Ralph Barclay had snatched him from the lower deck to become his clerk. He needed the man to get well, or he had to find another officer in need of his skills, perhaps a newly commissioned captain on this very ship. As to the stores, the idea of selling them was fine for a naval officer who knew their value. He did not, and would likely be cheated if he tried to shift them without help. Reluctantly he had to agree with Glaister. Only the purser balked at that idea, but he could not hold out against their combined view. It was fortunate that Glaister received orders to warp HMS Brilliant out of the inner harbour, which had come under intermittent cannon fire, a task he decided to undertake in the pre-dawn. Full casks sank, anything from nails to powder, as did bolts of canvas. The cable lengths of cordage did float, but not much more than that was left in the wake of the frigate as, once clear of the harbour, she raised her topsails to the morning light and sailed out to take station with the rest of the fleet. Approaching Toulon, every man on board with half a brain could see that the situation in the enclave had deteriorated. The French cannon were much further forward than previously, and the fire they were laying down took in not only the redoubts, but the town, the citadel, the inner harbour, and the dockyard. Making straight for victory, Pearce was into a boat and rowing across before his ship had come to rest. There was no delay either in him getting to see Lord Hood, finding sitting before him a man whose face looked weary, evidence of the strain he was under. Pearce delivered his message, which was bad, then underlined that with the negative dispatch from Commodore Lindsay.
"Parker, we must get the Prince aboard and ask him to stay his hand."
"I will send a message now, my lord."
Parker exited to carry out that task, and Pearce asked, wondering why he was feeling sorry for a man who had so used him as some kind of pawn, "How bad is it, sir?" Hood looked at him for a moment as though he was thinking if the questioner was worthy of a reply. But eventually he sighed and obliged.
"All over bar the shouting, Pearce, if we have no more troops. Without a proper attack, and with what we have now I cannot risk it, the French will have their guns up to close off the entrance to the P.3 within the week. And once that happens, the fleet must haul off to avoid being destroyed."
"And the French warships?"
"We will take what we can man, and burn the rest, Pearce, once we have set fire to and destroyed their arsenal and dockyards."
"I have no idea how many folk there are in Toulon."
"Too many, Pearce," Hood interrupted. "Far too many. Much as I would like to take them all off, it will be impossible."
"You will be leaving them, sir, to a grim fate."
"I reassure myself, Pearce, that I saved them from one some months ago. If Cato and his rabble had taken the port then, how many would have died?"
There was no point in alluding to the number of refugees that had since come into the port. Hood knew that as well as anyone. Nor was there any point in asking what else might be done. The Admiral would have been through that 100 times. Though it seemed callous to raise the matter, Pearce was forced to ask about the promise made to him being redeemed.
"At your convenience, Pearce,"
Hood replied, in a tone so weary it seemed unlike the same man who was forever castigating him for his insolence.
"I will make available to you the court-martial papers, and you can use one of my under-secretary's offices to make a fair copy. You would oblige me if you were to say in future that I had no hand in what you will do."
"Thank you, my lord." That brought a flash of the old Hood back.
"My lord! By damn, Pearce, have a care! You are, young sir, succumbing to a bout of manners."
"I must also ask how I am to get myself and my companions back to England."
"There will be transports loading the wounded from the St. Mondrier Hospital within a day or so. You and your companions will be ordered aboard that. Naturally, as many wounded men as possible will be taken back to England, especially the sailors. The wards at Haslar will be full for some time."
"Forgive me for mentioning this, sir, but will not the locals panic when they see the wounded being evacuated?" Hood stood up and went to look out of his casement windows, and for the first time Pearce was aware of this old man's spindly legs. He felt, unbidden as it was, a degree of respect for a fellow of 70 still able to command a fleet.
"That is the worry, Pearce. We must begin to make preparations this very day and move slowly so as to avoid mayhem. But we won't succeed, boy. We won't succeed."
Pearce was thinking of Barras, Fréron, and Augustin Robespierre. That guillotine in the square at Villefranche would be replicated in Toulon, and the blood would run like a torrent as they took their revenge. "The court-martial papers, my lord?"
"Help yourself, Pearce. I would not want it said I gave them to you."
As much as he knew what had taken place in that floating courtroom, John Pearce was surprised at the sheer blatant nature of the lies. But he had to stop himself from merely reading and write quickly to get down the mass of evidence, visited every so often by a flustered Hyde Parker and told to get a move on. It took hours, and all the time the thunder of gunfire echoed across the bay. When he finished, he used one of the Under-Secretary's oilskin pouches to house the evidence, then tucked it into his coat. He waited till Parker made another visit, acknowledged he was finished, and made his way to the entry port. He had what he needed now. He had his pelicans as good as free. Climbing into his boat, John Pearce looked forward in happy anticipation to telling them to gather up their dunnage, telling them that they were all about to shift ship to the hospital ship. That so, what had happened to them in the Pelican would be redressed, and they would be home and free from King George's navy. You have been listening to The Admiral's Game. It was written by David Donachie and read by Peter Wickham. Other recordings by David Donachie include The Dying Trade, A Flag of Truce, and An Awkward Commission. This has been a Soundings Audiobooks presentation. If you have enjoyed this production, please write to us at Isis House, King's Drive, Whitley Bay, Tyne and Wear, NE 26 2JT, or call 0191 253 4155, and you will be sent a full list of our recordings.